Part 3, Chapters 13 and 14 of Charles Rex by Ethel M. Dell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 13. The Truth. He went with careless tread, as his fashion was, whistling the gay air to which all England was dancing that season. His swarthy countenance wore the half-mischievous, half-amused expression with which it was his custom to confront and baffle the world at large. No one knew what lay behind that facile mask. Only the very few suspected that it hid aught beyond a genial wickedness of a curiously attractive type. His spurs rang upon the white stones, and Sheila Melrose, standing beside her father's car in the shadow of some buildings, turned sharply and saw him. Her face was pale, it had a strained expression. But it changed at sight of him. She regarded him with that look of frozen scorn which once she had flung him when they had met in the garish crowd at Valrosa. Bunny was stooping over the car, but he became aware of Saltash almost in the same moment, and stood up straight to face him. Sheila was pale, but he was perfectly white, and there were heavy drops of perspiration on his forehead. He looked full at Saltash with eyes of blazing accusation. Saltash's face never changed as he came up to the car. He ceased to whistle, but the old whimsical look remained. He seemed unaware of any tension. "Car all right?" he asked smoothly. "Can I lend a hand? The General is beginning to move." Sheila turned without a word and got into the car. Bunny neither moved nor spoke. He stood like a man paralyzed. It was Saltash who, with that royal air of amusing himself, stooped to the handle and started the engine. The girl at the wheel did not even thank him. She looked beyond. Only as he stood aside and the car slid forward, she turned stiffly to Bunny. "Good-bye," she said. He made a jerky movement. Their eyes met for a single second. "You will write?" he said. His throat was working spasmodically, the words seemed to come with gigantic effort. She bent her head in answer, and passed between them through the white gate into the drive that led round to the house. Saltash turned with a lightning movement to Bunny. "Walk back with me and we can talk," he said. Bunny drew sharply back. The movement was one of instinctive recoil. But still no words came. He stood staring at Saltash, and he was trembling from head to foot. "Don't be an ass now," Saltash said, and his voice was oddly gentle, even compassionate. "You've stumbled on a mare's nest. It's all right. I can explain." Bunny controlled himself with a jerk. His face was like death, but he found his voice. "You can keep your damned lies to yourself," he said. "I've no use for them." The prod of a riding switch against his shoulder made him start, as a spirited animal starts at the touch of a spur. But Saltash only laughed. "You'll fight me for that." "I wouldn't touch you," flung back Bunny. "Oh, wouldn't you?" The odd eyes mocked him openly. "Then you withdraw the insult, with apologies?" "Apologize? To you?" said Bunny. "Or fight," said Saltash. "I think that would do you more good than the other, but you shall decide." "I will do neither," said Bunny, and turned his back with the words, "I've done with you." "You're wrong," said Saltash. "You've got to face it, and you won't get the truth from anyone but me. That girl knows nothing, Bunny." His voice was suddenly curt, with that in it which very few ever heard. "Turn around. Do you hear? Turn round, damn you. I'll kick you if you don't." Bunny turned. It was inevitable. They stood face to face. Then Saltash, the mockery gone from his eyes, reached out abruptly and gripped him by the arm. His touch was electric. For that moment, only for that moment, he was dangerous. There was something of the spring of a tiger in his action. "You damn fool," he said, and he spoke between his teeth. "Do you suppose even I would play such a blackguard's game as that?" "Let me go," Bunny said through white lips. "Facts are facts." Saltash's hold did not slacken. "Where's Jake?" he said. "Jake's away." "Confound him, just when he's wanted." The ferocity died out of Saltash like the glow from cinders blown from a furnace. "Well, listen. I swear to you by all that is sacred that you are making a mistake. Sheila has told you a certain thing that is true, so far as it goes. But you've let your imagination run away with you. The rest is false." He spoke with an emphasis that carried weight, and Bunny was moved in spite of himself. His own fire died down. Saltash saw his advantage and pressed it. "If Jake were here he'd tell you I was speaking the truth, and you'd believe him. You're on a wrong scent. So far as I'm concerned, you're welcome to follow it to blazes. I'm used to pleasantries of that sort from my friends. But I'm damned if I'll let that child be tripped for nothing. Do you hear, Bunny?" He shook the arm he gripped impatiently. "I'll see you in hell first." Bunny's mouth twisted with a painful effort to smile. "I'm in hell now," he said. "Why the devil did you listen?" said Saltash. "Look here, we've got to have this thing out. Send a man along with my horse and walk across the park with me." He had gained his point by sheer insistence, and he knew it. Bunny knew it also, and cursed himself for a weak fool as he moved to comply. With Saltash's blade through his heart, he yet could somehow find it possible to endure him. He went with him in silence, hating the magnetism he found it impossible to resist. They passed through the shrubberies that skirted the house, and so to the open down. Then, in his sudden fashion, crudely and vehemently, Saltash began his defense. "It's not my way," he said, "to give an answer to any man who questions, but you haven't stooped to question. So I tell you the truth. Sheila saw Toby working as a page at the Casino Hotel at Valrosa. That right?" "I thought so. It's the whole matter in a nutshell. I must have seen her too, but never noticed her till my last night in the place. Then I found Antonio hammering the poor little beggar out in the garden, and I stopped it. You'd have done the same. Afterwards, late that night, I went on board the yacht and found her down in the saloon, a stowaway. The yacht had started. I could have put back, but I didn't. You wouldn't have done either. She took refuge with me. I sheltered her. She came to me as a boy. I treated her as such." "You knew?" flung in Bunny. Saltash's grin flashed across his dark features, like a meteor through a cloudy sky, and was gone. "I suspected, mon ami, but I did not even tell myself." That part of him that was French, a species of volatile sentimentality, sounded in the words like the echo of a laugh in a minor key. "I made a valet of her. I suffered her to clean my boots and brush my clothes. I kept her in order, with this, upon occasion." He held up the switch he carried. "I don't believe it," said Bunny bluntly. Saltash's shoulders went up. "You please yourself, mon cher. I'm telling you the truth. I treated her like a puppy. I was kind to her, but never extravagantly kind. But eventually I decided, that it was time to turn home. No game can last forever. So we returned, and on our last night at sea we were rammed and sunk. Naturally that spoilt, or shall I say somewhat precipitated, my plans. We were saved, the two of us together. And then was started that scandalous report of the woman on the yacht." Again the laughter sounded in his voice. "You see, mon ami, how small a spark can start a conflagration. In self-defense I had to invent something, and I invented it quickly. I said she was Larpent's daughter. I wonder if you would have thought of that. You'd have done it if you had, I'll wager." He turned upon the boy, who strode in silence by his side with a gleam of triumph in his eyes, but there was no answering gleam in Bunny's. He moved heavily, staring straight before him, his face drawn in hard lines of misery. "Well," Saltash said, "that's all I have done. You now know the truth, simple and unadorned, as Sheila Melrose in her simplicity does not know it, and probably would not comprehend it if she did." "Leave her out of it," said Bunny in a strangled voice. "It was the obvious conclusion." "Oh, the obvious." Cynicism undisguised caught up the word. "Only the young and innocent can ever really say with any conviction what is the obvious way of blackguards. You don't know it. Neither do I. A single decent impulse on the part of a blackguard can upset all the calculations of the virtuous. Oh, Bunny, you fool! What do you want to wreck things for at this stage? Can't you see you've got a gift from the gods? Take it, man, and be thankful that you're considered worthy of it." Bunny made a sharp movement of protest. Saltash was looking at him with half humorous compassion, as one looks at a child with a damaged toy, and he was keenly conscious of being at a disadvantage. But though checked, he was not defeated. Saltash had made out a case for himself. He had in a measure vindicated Toby. But that was not the end of the matter. He stopped and faced him. "Why were you so anxious for me to marry her?" he said. "I've got to know that." He was instantly aware that Saltash eluded him, even though he seemed to meet his look as he made reply. "You are quite welcome to know it, mon ami. I chance to take a fatherly interest in you both." Bunny flinched a little. Something in the light reply had pierced him, though he could not have said how. "That's all?" he asked rather thickly. "That is quite all," said Saltash, and faintly smiled, the smile of the practised swordsman behind the blade. Bunny stood for some moments regarding him, his boyish face stern and troubled. Up to that point, against his will, he had believed him. From it he believed him no longer. But he faced the truth however it might gall him. He was pitted against a skilled fencer, and he was powerless. Experience could baffle him at every turn. "Do you tell me you have never realized that she cared for you?" he blurted forth abruptly, and there was something akin to agony in his utterance of the words. He knew that he was baring his breast for the stroke as he forced them out. But Saltash did not strike. Just for an instant he showed surprise. Then, quite suddenly, he lowered his weapon. He faced Bunny with a smile of comradeship. "Quite honestly, Bunny," he said, "if I had realized it, it wouldn't have made any difference. I have no use for sentimental devotion at my age. She has never been more to me than a puppy that plays with your hand." "Ah," Bunny said, and swung away from him with the words, "I suppose that is how you treat them all. Women and dogs, they're very much alike." "Not in every respect," said Saltash. "I should say that Toby is an exception, anyway. She knows play from earnest." "Does she?" said Bunny. He paused a moment, as if trying to concentrate his forces, then he turned to Saltash again. "I'm going back now. I can't dine with you, though I've no desire to quarrel. But you see, you must understand, that I can never accept anything from you again. I'm sorry, but I can't." "What are you going to do?" said Saltash. Bunny hesitated, his boyish face a white mask of misery. Saltash reached out a second time and touched him lightly, almost caressingly, with the point of his switch. "What's the matter with you, Bunny?" he said. "Think I've lied to you?" Bunny met his look. "I don't want to quarrel with you," he said. Somehow it isn't worth it." "Thanks," said Saltash, and briefly laughed. "You place my friendship at a pretty high figure, then. Tell me what you're going to do." "What is it to you what I do?" A quick gleam shone for an instant in Bunny's eyes, dispelling the look of stricken misery. "I'm not asking you to help me." "I've grasped that," said Saltash. "But even so, I may be able to lend a hand. As you say, there is not much point in our quarreling. There's nothing to quarrel about that I can see, except that you've called me a liar for no particular good reason. Do you object to that?" said Bunny. Saltash made a careless gesture. "Perhaps, as you say, it isn't worth it. All the same, I've a certain right to know what you propose to do, since I gather I have not managed to satisfy you." "A right?" flashed Bunny. "Yes, a right." Saltash's voice was suddenly and suavely confident. "You may forget, or possibly you may remember, that I gave my protection to Nanette on the day she came to me for it, and I have never withdrawn it since. What matters to her matters to me." "I see." Bunny stood stiffly facing him. "I am responsible to you, am I?" "That is what I am trying to convey," said Saltash. The fire in Bunny's eyes leapt high for a moment or two, then died down again. Had Jake been his opponent he would have flung an open challenge, but somehow Saltash, with whom he had never before striven in his life, was less easy to resist. In some subtle fashion he seemed able to evade resistance and yet to gain his point. He gained his point on this occasion. Almost before he knew it, Bunny had yielded. "I am going to her," he said, "to ask her for the whole truth about her past." "Is any woman capable of telling the truth to that extent?" questioned Saltash. "I shall know if she doesn't," said Bunny doggedly. "And will that help?" The note of mockery that was never long absent from his voice sounded again. "Isn't it possible, sometime, to try to know too much? There is such a thing as looking too closely, mon ami. And then we pay the price." "Do you imagine I could ever be satisfied not knowing?" said Bunny. Saltash shrugged his shoulders. "I merely suggested that you are going the wrong way to satisfy yourself. But that is your affair, not mine. The gods have sent you a gift, and because you don't know what it is made of you are going to pull it to pieces to find out. And presently you will fling it away because you cannot fit it together again. You don't realize, you never will realize, that the best things in life are the things we never see and only dimly understand." A vein of sincerity mingled with the banter in his voice, and Bunny was aware of a curious quality of reverence, of something sacred in a waste place. It affected him oddly. Convinced though he was that in one point at least Saltash had sought to deceive him, it yet influenced him very strongly in Saltash's favour. Against his judgment, against his will even, he saw him as a friend. "Do you mean to tell me," he said, speaking slowly, his eyes upon the swarthy, baffling countenance, "that you have never even tried to know where she came from, what she is?" Saltash made a quick gesture as of remonstrance. "Mon ami, the last I have always known. The first I have never needed to know." "Then," Bunny spoke with difficulty, but his look never wavered, "tell me, as before God, tell me what you believe her to be." "What I know her to be," corrected Saltash. "I will tell you, certainly. She is a child who has looked into hell, but she is still a child." "What do you mean?" questioned Bunny. Saltash's eyes, one black, one grey, suddenly flashed a direct challenge into his own. "I mean," he said, "that the flame has scorched her, but it has never actually touched her." "You know that?" Bunny's voice was hoarse. There was torture in his eyes. "Man, for God's sake, the truth." "It is the truth," Saltash said. "How do you know it? You've no proof. How can you be sure?" He could not help the anguish of his voice. The words fell harsh and strained. "How do I know it?" Saltash echoed the words sharply. "What proof? Bunny, you fool, do you know so little of the world, of women, as that? What proof do you need? Just look into her eyes." A queer note of passion sounded in his own voice, and it told Bunny very clearly that he was grappling with the naked truth at last. It arrested him in a moment. He suddenly found that he could go no further. There was no need. Impulsively, with an inarticulate word of apology, he thrust out his hand. Saltash's came to meet it in a swift, hard grip. "Enough?" he asked with that odd, smiling grimace of his that revealed so little. And, "Yes, enough," Bunny said, looking him straight in the face. They parted almost without words a few minutes later. There was no more to be said. 14. The Last Card. Saltash dined alone that night. He was in a restless mood and preoccupied, scarcely noticing what was put before him, pushing the wine away untasted. In the end he rose from the table almost with a gesture of disgust. "I'm going to smoke on the ramparts," he said to the decorous butler who waited upon him. "If anyone should call to see me, let them wait in the music room." "Very good, my lord. And where would you like to take coffee?" inquired the man sedately. Saltash laughed. "Not on the ramparts, emphatically. I'll have mercy on you to that extent. Put it on the spirit lamp in the music room and leave it. You needn't sit up, any of you. I'll put out the lights." "Very good, my lord." The man withdrew and Saltash chose a cigar. An odd grimace drew his features as he lighted it. He had the look of a man who surveys his last card and knows himself a loser. Though he went out of the room and up the great staircase to the music room with his head up and complete indifference in his carriage, his eyelids were slightly drawn. He did not look as if he had enjoyed the game. A single red lamp lighted the music room, and the long apartment looked dim and ghostly. He stood for a moment as he entered it and looked round, Then, with a scarcely perceptible lift of the shoulders, he passed straight through to the curtain that hung before the door leading to the turret. The darkness of the place gaped before him, and he turned back with a muttered word and recrossed the room. There were Persian rugs upon the floor, and his feet made no sound. He went to the mantelpiece, and, feeling along it, found a small electric torch. The light of it flared before him as he returned. The door yielded to his touch and swung shut behind him. He passed into vault-like silence. The stone steps gave back the sound of his tread as he mounted, with eerie, wandering echoes. The grey walls glimmered with a ghostly desolation around him. Half-way up, he stopped to flick the ash from his cigar, and laughed aloud. But the echoes of his laughter sounded like voices crying in the darkness. He went on more swiftly, like a phantom imprisoned and seeking escape. The echoes met him and fell away behind him. The loneliness was like a curse. The very air felt dead. He reached the top of the turret at last, and the heavy door that gave upon the ramparts. With a sound that was almost a gasp, he pushed it open and passed out into the open air. A full moon was shining, and his acres lay below him, a wonderful picture in black and silver. He came to the first gap in the battlements, mounted the parapet, and stood there with a hand resting on each side. The wash of the sea came murmurously through the September silence. His restless eyes flashed hither and thither over the quiet scene, taking in every detail, lingering nowhere. The pine trees stirred in the distance below him, seeming to whisper together, and an owl hooted with a weird persistence down by the lake. It was like the calling of a human voice, almost like a cry of distress. Then it ceased, and the trees were still again. The spell of the silence fell like the falling of a curtain. The loneliness crept about his heart. He took the cigar from his mouth and spoke ironically, grimly. "There is your kingdom, Charles Rex," he said. He turned with the words and leaped down upon the narrow walk between the battlements. The owl began to call again, but the desolation remained. He paced forward with his hands behind him, his head bent. No one could see him here. The garment of mockery could be flung aside. He was like a prisoner tramping the stone walls from which he could never escape. He paused once to toss away his cigar, but he did not look out again over the fair prospect of his lands. He was looking at other things, seeing the vast emptiness of a life that had never been worth while stretching behind and before him. Like a solitary traveler pausing in the heart of the desert, he stood to view the barrenness around him. He had traveled far, had pursued many a quest with ardor, but the ardor had all gone out of him now. Only the empty solitude remained. He had lived a life of fevered variety, he had drunk deep of many waters, but he had never been satisfied. And now it seemed to him that all he had ever looked upon, all he had ever achieved, was mirage. Nothing of all that he had ever striven for was left. The fruit had turned to ashes in his mouth, and no spring remained whereat to quench his thirst. Perhaps few men have ever realized the utter waste of wickedness as Charles Rex realized it that night. He met it whichever way he turned. To gratify the moment's whim had ever been his easy habit. If a generous impulse had moved him, he had gratified that also. But it had never been his way to sacrifice himself, until a certain night when a child had come to him, wide-eyed and palpitating like a driven bird, and had sought shelter and protection at his hands. That, very curiously, had been the beginning of a new era in his life. It had appealed to him as nothing had ever appealed before. He had never tasted, or even desired, the Dead Sea fruit again. Something had entered his being on that night which he had never been able to cast out, and all other things had been dwarfed to insignificance. He faced the fact as he paced his castle walls. The relish had gone out of his life. He was gathering what he had sown, and the harvest was barren indeed. Time passed. He walked, unheeding. If he spent the whole night on the ramparts there was no one to know or care. It was better than tossing sleepless under a roof. He felt as if a roof would suffocate him. But sheer physical weariness began to oppress even his elastic frame at last. He awoke to the fact that he was dead tired. He sat down in an embrasure between the battlements and drifted into the numb state between waking and sleeping in which visions are born. For a space nothing happened, then quite suddenly, rising as it were out of a void, a presence entered his consciousness, reached and touched his spirit. Intangibly, but quite unmistakably, he was aware of the summons, of a voice that spoke within his soul. He lifted his head and looked about him. Emptiness, stark emptiness, was all he saw. Yet, in a moment, as though a hand had beckoned, he arose. Without a backward glance he traversed the distance that lay between him and the turret door. He went through it into utter darkness, and in utter darkness began the descent. A shaft of moonlight smote through a slit in the stone wall as he rounded the corner of the stair. It lay like a shining sword across his path, and for a second he paused. Then he passed over it, sure-footed and confident, and plunged again into the darkness. When he reached the end of the descent he was breathing heavily, and his eyes were alight with a strange fire. He pulled upon the door and put aside the thick curtain with the swift movements of a man who can brook no delay. He passed into the long dim room beyond with its single red lamp burning at the far end. He prepared to pass on to the door that led out upon the gallery and so to the grand staircase. But before he had gone half a dozen paces he stopped. It was no sound that arrested, no visible circumstance of any sort. Yet, as if at a word of command, he halted. His quick look swept around the room like the gleam of a rapier, and suddenly he swung upon his heel, facing that still red light. Seconds passed before he moved again. Then swiftly and silently he walked up the room. Close to the lamp was a deep settee on which the spots of a leopard skin showed in weird relief. At one end of the settee, against the leopard skin, something gold was shining. Saltash's look was fixed upon it as he drew near. He reached the settee, treading noiselessly. He stood beside it, looking down. And over his dark face with its weary lines and cynical mouth, its melancholy and its bitterness, there came a light such as neither man nor woman had ever seen upon it before. For there, before him, curled up like a tired puppy, her tumbled golden hair lying in ringlets over the leopard skin, was Toby, asleep in the dim red lamplight. For minutes he stood and gazed upon her before she awoke. For minutes that strange glory came and went over his watching face. He did not stir, did not even seem to breathe. But the fact of his presence must have pierced her consciousness at last, for in the end, quite quietly, supremely naturally, the blue eyes opened and fixed upon him. "Hello," said Toby sleepily. "Time to get up." And then, in a moment, she had sprung upright on the couch, swift dismay on her face. I thought we were on the yacht. I never meant to go to sleep here. I came to speak to you, sir. I wanted to see you." He put a restraining hand upon her thin young shoulder, and his touch vibrated as with some unknown force controlled. "All right, Nonette," he said, and his voice had the same quality. It was reassuring but oddly unsteady. "Sorry I kept you waiting." She looked at him. Her face was quivering. "I've had a hell of a time," she said pathetically. "Been here hours. Thought you'd never come. Your man said I wasn't to disturb you." "Damn the fool!" said Saltash. She broke into a breathless laugh. That's just what I said. But I thought perhaps you'd rather I waited." She shivered suddenly. "I don't like this place. Can you take me somewhere else?" He bent lower, put his hand under her elbow and helped her to her feet. She came up from the couch with a spring and stood before him, half daring and half shy. Saltash kept his hold upon her arm and turned her towards the wall beside the tall mantelpiece. She went with him readily enough, watching, eager-eyed, as he stretched his free hand up to the oak panelling. "Now I'm going to find out all your secrets," she said boyishly. "Not quite all," said Saltash. There came the click of a spring, and the panel slid to one side, leaving a long narrow opening before them. Toby glanced up at him, and with a small nestling movement slipped within the circle of his arm. It tightened upon her in an instant, and she laughed again, a quivering, exultant laugh. "I'm glad you've come," she said. They paused on the edge of darkness, but there was no hesitation about Toby. She was all athrill with expectancy. Then, in a flash, the room before them was illuminated, and they entered. It was a strange chamber, panelled, built in the shape of a cone. A glass dome formed its roof, and there was no window besides. The lights were cunningly concealed behind a weirdly coloured fresco of Oriental figures. But one lamp alone on a small table burned with a still red glow. This lamp was supported on the stuffed skin of a hooded cobra. Toby's eyes were instantly drawn towards it. They shone with excitement. Again she glanced up at the man beside her. "What a wonderful place!" "Better than the music room?" suggested Saltash. "Oh, yes, far better." Her shining eyes sought his. "It might be your cabin on the yacht." He stretched a hand behind him, and again the spring clicked. Then he drew her forward. They trod on tiger skins. Everywhere were tiger skins, on the floor and on a deep low settee by the table which was the only other furniture the room possessed. Toby was clinging to the arm that held her, clinging very closely. There was unspoken entreaty in her hold. For there was something about Saltash at the moment, something unfamiliar and unfathomable, that frightened her. His careless drollery, his two-edged ironies were naught to her, but his silence was a barrier unknown that she could not pass. She could only cling voicelessly to the support he had not denied her. He brought her to the settee and stood still. His face was strangely grim. "Well, Toby," he said. She twisted in his hold and faced him, but she kept his arm wound close about her, her hand tight gripped on his. "Are you angry with me for coming?" she asked him quiveringly. "I had to come." He looked down into her eyes. "Bien, petite. Then you need a friend?" he said. Her answering look was piteous. "I need you," she said. One of the old gay smiles flashed across his face. He seemed to challenge her to lightness. The grimness went out of his eyes like a shadow. "And so you have come, my mignonette, at the dead of night, at the risk of your reputation and mine." Toby made an excruciating grimace and broke impulsively in upon him. "It wasn't the dead of night when I started. I've been waiting hours. But it doesn't matter. I've found you, at last. And you can't send me away now, like you did before, because, well, I've no one to go to. You might have done it if you'd come down earlier. But you can't do it, now." Her voice thrilled on a high note of triumph. "You've got to keep me, now. I've come to stay." "What?" said Saltash. He bent towards her, looking closely into her face. "Got to keep you, have I? What's that mean? Has Bunny been a brute to you? I could have sworn I'd made him understand." She laughed in answer. "Bunny? I didn't wait to see him." "What?" Saltash said again. She reached up a quick, nervous hand and laid it against his breast. Her eyes, wide and steadfast, never flinched from his. "I've come to stay," she repeated. And then, after a moment, "It's all right. I left a note behind for Bunny. I told him I wasn't going back." He caught her hand tightly into his. His hold was drawing her, and she yielded herself to it, still with that quivering laughter that was somehow more eloquent than words, more piteous than tears. Saltash spoke below his breath. "What am I going to do with you?" he said. Her arms reached up to him suddenly. Perhaps it was that for which she had waited. "You're going to keep me this time," she told him tremulously. "Oh, why did you ever send me away, when I belonged to you, and to no one else? You meant to give me my chance. What chance have I of anything but hell and damnation away from you? No, listen. Let me speak. Hear me first." She uttered the words with passionate insistence. "I'm not asking anything of you, only to be with you. I'll be to you whatever you choose me to be, always, always. I will be your valet, your slave, your plaything. I will be the dust under your feet. But I must be with you. You understand me. No one else does. No one else ever can."
"Are you sure you understand yourself?" Saltash said.
His arms had closed about her. He was holding her in a vital clasp. But his restless look did not dwell upon her. It seemed rather to be seeking something beyond. Toby's hands met and gripped each other behind his neck. She clung to him with an almost frenzied closeness. "You can't send me away," she told him brokenly. "If you do, I shall die. And I'm asking such a little, such a very little."
"You don't know what you're asking, child," he said. And though he held her fast pressed to him, his voice had the somber ring of a man who battles with misgiving. "You have never known. That's the hell of it."
"I do know," she flung back almost fiercely. "I know all I need to know of most things. I know very well," her breath came quickly, but still her eyes remained upraised, "what would have happened, what was bound to happen, if the yacht had never gone down. I wasn't afraid then. I'm not now. You're the only man on this earth that I'd say it to. I hate men, most men. But to you, a sudden sob caught her voice. She paused to steady it. To you, I just want to be whatever you're needing most in life. And when I can't be that to you any longer, I'll just drop out, as I promised, and you shall never know a thing about it. That I swear." His look came swiftly to her. The blue eyes were swimming in tears. He made a sudden gesture as of capitulation, and the strain went out of his look. His arms tightened like springs about her. He spoke lightly, jestingly. "Bien. Shall I tell you what you shall be to me, mignonne?" he said, and smiled down at her with his royal air of confidence. She trembled a little and was silent, realizing that he had suddenly leapt to a decision, fearing desperately what that decision might be. His old baffling mask of banter had wholly replaced the sombreness, but she was aware of a force behind it that gripped her irresistibly. She could not speak in answer. "I will tell you," he said, and his dark face laughed into hers with a merriment half mischievous, half kindly. "I am treading the path of virtue, mignonne, and uncommon lonely I'm finding it. You shall relieve the monotony. We will be virtuous together, for a while. You shall be my wife." He stooped with the words, and ere she knew it, his lips were on her own. But his kiss, though tender, was as baffling as his smile. It was not the kiss of a lover. She gasped and shrank away. "Your wife? You're joking. How could I be your wife?" "You and none other," he declared gaily. "Egad, it's the very thing for us. Why did I never think of it before? I will order the state coach at once. We will go to town, elope and be married before the world begins to buzz. What are you frightened at, sweetheart? Why this alarm? Wouldn't you rather be my wife than the dust beneath my feet?" I don't know," faltered Toby, and hid her face from the dancing raillery in his eyes. His hold was close and sheltering, but he laughed at her without mercy.
"Does the prospect make you giddy? You will soon get over that. You will take the world by storm, mignonne. You will be the talk of the town."
"Oh, no," breathed Toby. "No, I couldn't."
"What?" he jested. "You are going to refuse my suit?"
She turned and clung to him with a passionate, even fierce intensity, but she did not lift her face again to his. Her voice came muffled against his breast. "I could never refuse you anything."
"Eh bien! Then all is well," he declared. "My bride will hold her own wherever she goes, save with her husband, and to him she will yield her wifely submission at all times. Do you know what they will say, all of them, when they hear that Charles Rex is married at last?"
"What?" whispered Toby apprehensively. He bent his head, still laughing.
"Shall I tell you? Can't you guess?"
"No, tell me," she said. He touched the soft ringlets of her hair with his lips.
"They will say, 'God help his wife,' mignonne. And I shall answer, 'Amen.'"
She lifted her face suddenly and defiantly, her eyes afire. "Do you know what I shall say if they do?" she said. "What?" said Saltash, his own eyes gleaming oddly. "I shall tell them," said Toby tensely, to go to blazes." He grimaced his appreciation. "Then they will begin to pity the husband, chérie." She held up her lips to his, childishly, lovingly. "I will be good," she said. "I will be good. I will never say such things again." He kissed the trembling lips again, lightly, caressingly. "Oh, don't be too good," he said. "I couldn't live up to it. You shall say what you like, do what you like, and you shall be my queen." She caught back another sob. Her clinging arms tightened. "And you will be what you have always been," she said. "My king, my king, my king." In the silence that followed the passionate words, Charles Rex very gently loosened the clinging arms and set her free. End of Part 3, Chapters 13 and 14. Part 4, Chapters 1 and 2 of Charles Rex by Ethel M. Dell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 1. The Winning Post. "I never thought it would be like this," said Toby. She spoke aloud, though she was alone. She stood at an immense window on the first floor of a busy Paris hotel, and stared down into the teeming courtyard below. Her fair face wore a whimsical expression that was half of amusement and half of discontent. She looked absurdly young, almost childish, but her blue eyes were unmistakably wistful. Below her seethed the crowd of vehicles of every description, and the babble that came up to her was as the roar of a great torrent. It seemed to sweep away all coherent thought, for she smiled as she gazed downwards, and her look held interest in the busy scene even though the hint of melancholy lingered. There was certainly plenty to occupy her, and it was not in her nature to be bored. But yet, at the opening of a door in the room behind her, she turned very swiftly, and in a moment her face was alight with an ardent welcome. "Ah, here you are," she said. He came forward in his quick, springy fashion, his odd eyes laughing their gay, unstable greeting into hers. He took the hands she held out to him, and bending, lightly kissed them. "Have you been bored? Mais non, I have not been so long gone. Why are you not still resting, chérie, as I told you?" She looked at him, and still, though her eyes laughed their gladness, the wistfulness remained. "I am quite rested, monseigneur." "And the tiredness quite gone? And now you are going to take me to see the sights of Paris?" "Those of them you don't know," suggested Saltash. She nodded. "I don't know very many. I never went very far. I was afraid." He twisted his hand through her arm, and his fingers closed upon her wrist. "You are not afraid with me?" he questioned. Her eyes answered him before her voice. "Never, monseigneur." "Why do you call me that?" said Saltash. She colored at the abrupt question. "It suits you." He made his monkeyish grimace, and suddenly dropped his eyes to the blue veined wrist in his grasp. "Are you happy, mignonne?" he asked her, still obviously in jesting mood. Toby's eyes dropped also. She mutely nodded. "The truth, Nonette?" His look flashed over her, his tone was imperious. She nodded again. "I always tell you the truth." He began to laugh. "Mais vraiment? I had not thought that likely. Then you do not want to leave me yet?" "Leave you?" Her eyes came up to his in wide amazement. "I?" "We have been married 3 days," he reminded her, with comically working brows. "And have I not already begun to leave you, to neglect you?" I never expected anything else," stammered Toby, suddenly averting her face. He patted her cheek with careless kindliness. "How wise of you, my dear! How wise! Then you are not yet sufficiently ennuyée to desire to leave me?" "Why do you ask?" questioned Toby. There was a species of malicious humour about him that made her uneasy. Saltash, in a mischievous mood, was not always easy to restrain. He did not immediately reply to her question, and she turned with a hint of panic and tightly clasped his arm. "It is you who are ennuyé," she said, with piteous eyes upraised. He flicked her cheek with his thumb, his odd eyes gleaming. "Not so, milady Saltash. For me, the game is just begun. But, should you desire to leave me, the opportunity is yours. A knight has arrived to the rescue, a very puissant knight." "A knight?" gasped Toby, trembling. "Ah, tell me what you mean." His look was openly mocking. "A knight in gaiters," he told her lightly. "A knight who bears, or should bear, a horsewhip in place of a sword. That is, if I know him aright." "Jake!" she gasped incredulously. He laughed afresh. "Even so. Jake. Most worthy and most obtrusive. What shall we do with him, lady mine? Slay him, or give him a feed and send him home?" She stared at him aghast. You are joking," she stammered. "I always joke when I am most serious," Saltash assured her. "Oh, don't!" She clung closer to his arm. "What shall we do? He can't do anything, can he? We really are married, aren't we?" Saltash's most appalling grimace fled like a hunted goblin across his face. "Married? Heavens, child, what more do you want? Haven't you seen it, actually seen it in our greatest London daily? And can a London daily lie? You may have dreamed the wedding, but that paragraph, it takes a genius of the first literary degree to dream a paragraph, though it may only need quite an ordinary fool to write it. Why, what is the matter? What is it? Did you see something? Not a mouse? Not a beetle? I prithee, not a beetle." For Toby had suddenly hidden her face against his shoulder, and there was actual panic in the clinging of her arms. He laid a hand upon her head and patted it lightly, admonishingly. She did not speak for a second or two, only gulped with desperate effort at self-restraint. Then, at length, in a muffled voice, "Don't let him take me away," she besought him shakily. You've promised to keep me now." "But of course I'm keeping you," said Saltash. "It's what I did it for. It's the very essence of the game. Cheer up, Nonette. I'm not parting with any of my goods, worldly or otherwise, this journey." "You are sure?" whispered Toby. "Sure?" "Sure of what?" He bent swiftly, and for a second, only a second, his lips touched her hair. "Sure you don't want to?" came in a gasp from Toby as she burrowed a little deeper. "Oh, that!" Saltash stood up again, and his face was sardonic, for the moment almost grim. "Yes, quite sure of that, my dear. Moreover, it will amuse me to meet the virtuous Jake on his own ground for once. A new sensation, Nonette. Will you help me to face him? Or do you prefer the more early Victorian role of the lady who retires till the combat is over, and then emerges to reward the winner?" She lifted her head at that, and uttered a scoffing little laugh, withdrawing herself abruptly from his support. Her pointed chin went up with a hint of defiance. All signs of agitation were gone. "I'll stay and help you," she said. He made her an elaborate bow. "Then we will ring up the curtain. I congratulate you, madam, upon your spirit. I trust the interview will not try your fortitude too far. Remember, should your feminine ears be shocked by anything that may pass between us, it is up to you to retire at any moment." Toby's blue eyes caught sudden fire. She broke into an unexpected chuckle. "I do not think I am likely to retire for that reason, monseigneur," she said. "Where is he? How did you know he was coming?" "Because he is already here," said Saltash. "I passed him at the office making inquiries. He had his back to me, but there is no mistaking that bull neck of his. Ah!" He turned his head sharply. "I hear a step outside. Sit down, mignonne. Sit down and be dignified." But Toby's idea of dignity was to sit on the corner of the table and swing one leg. If any apprehension lingered in her mind, she concealed it most successfully. She looked like an alert and mischievous boy. There came a knock at the door, and for a moment her eyes sought Saltash. He grinned back derisively, and pulled out his cigarette case. "Entrez," he called. The door opened with a flourish. A waiter entered with a card. Saltash barely looked at him. His eyes flashed beyond to the open doorway. "You can come in," he remarked affably. "We've been expecting you for some time." Jake entered. His square frame seemed to fill the space between the doorposts. He was empty-handed, but there was purpose, grim purpose, in every line of him. Saltash dismissed the waiter with a jerk of the eyebrows. He was utterly unabashed, amazingly self-assured. He met Jake's stern eyes with cheery effrontery. "Quite like old times," he commented. "The only difference being, my good Jake, that on this occasion I have reached the winning post first." Jake's look went beyond him to the slight figure by the table. Toby was on her feet. Her face was flushed, but her eyes were wide and defiant. He regarded her steadily for several seconds before, very deliberately, he transferred his attention to Saltash, who nonchalantly awaited his turn, tapping the cigarette on the lid of his case with supreme indifference. Jake spoke, his voice soft as a woman's, yet strangely dominating. "I should like 2 minutes alone with you, if you can spare them." Saltash was smiling. His glance shot towards Toby and came back to Jake with a certain royal arrogance that held its own without effort. "In other words, you wish Lady Saltash to leave us?" he questioned easily. "I'm not going," said Toby quickly, with nervous decision. Her hands were tightly clasped in front of her. She stood as one strung to the utmost limit of resistance. Jake did not again look at her. His eyes were upon Saltash, and they never wavered. "Alone with you," he repeated with grim insistence. Saltash regarded him curiously. His mouth twitched mockingly as he put the cigarette between his lips. He held out the case to Jake in mute invitation. Jake's look remained fixed. He ignored the action, and the case snapped shut in Saltash's hand with a sharp sound that seemed to denote a momentary exasperation. But Saltash's face still retained the monkey-like expression of calculated mischief habitual to it. "Bunny with you?" he inquired casually, producing a matchbox. "No." Very quietly came Jake's answer. "I have come to see you. Alone." Saltash lighted his cigarette and blew a careless cloud of smoke. "Are you proposing to shoot me?" he asked after a pause. "No," said Jake grimly. "Shooting's too good for you. Men like you." Saltash laughed and blew another cloud of smoke. "That may be why I have survived so long," he remarked. "I don't see the horsewhip either. Jake, my friend, you are not rising to the occasion with becoming enthusiasm. Any good offering you a drink to stimulate your energies?" "None whatever," said Jake, still very quietly. "I don't go till I have what I came for. That's all. Neither do you." "I see," said Saltash. An odd little gleam that was almost furtive shone for a second in his eyes and was gone. He turned and crossed the room to Toby. "My dear," he said, "I think this business will be more quickly settled if you leave us." She looked at him piteously. He took her lightly by the arm and led her to a door leading to an adjoining room. "By the time you have smoked one cigarette," he said, "I shall be with you again." She turned with an impulsive attempt to cling to him. "You'll keep me?" she said through trembling lips. He made a royal gesture that frustrated her with perfect courtesy. "Are you not my wife?" he said. He opened the door for her, and she had no choice but to go through. She went swiftly without another glance, and Saltash closed the door behind her. 2. The Villain Scores. "Now, sir," said Saltash, and turned. His tone was brief. The smile had gone from his face. He came to Jake with a certain haughtiness and stood before him. Jake squared his shoulders. "So you've married her," he said. "I have." There was a note of challenge in the curt rejoinder. Saltash's brows were drawn. "I should like to see proof of that," Jake said after a moment. "The devil you would!" Again the hot gleam shone in the odd eyes. Saltash stood for a moment in the attitude of a man on the verge of violence. Then, contemptuously, he relaxed. He lounged back against the mantelpiece and smoked his cigarette. "The devil you would, Jake," he said again, in a tone so different that the words might have been uttered in another language.
"And why, if one be permitted to ask?" "I think you know why," Jake said. "Oh, do I? You virtuous people are always the first to suspect evil." Saltash spoke with deliberate cynicism. "And suppose the marriage is not genuine, as you so politely hint. What then, my worthy Jake? What then?" Jake faced him unwaveringly. "If not," he said, "she goes back with me." Saltash's eyes suddenly flashed to his, but he did not alter his position. "Sure of that?" he asked casually. "Sure," said Jake. "And if I refuse to part with her? If she refuses to go?" "Either way," said Jake immovably. "And why?" Saltash straightened suddenly. "Tell me why. What in hell has it got to do with you?" "This," said Jake. "Just the fact that she's a girl needing protection, and that I can give it." "Are you sure of that?" jibed Saltash. "I think you forget, don't you, that I was her first protector. No one, not even Bunny, could have got near her without my consent." "She was your find, right enough," Jake admitted. "I always knew that, knew from the first you'd faked up a lie about her. But I hoped, I even believed, that you were doing it for her sake, not your own." "Well?" flung Saltash. "And if I was?" "And if you were," said Jake, "it was a thing worth doing, worth sticking to. Bunny is a respectable citizen. He'd have married her, made her happy." Saltash's mouth twisted. "Bunny had his chance, missed it," he said. "He'll know better next time. I'm not troubling about Bunny. He didn't deserve to win." "And so you decided to play him a damn trick and cut him out?" said Jake. Saltash snapped his fingers. "I did my best for him, but I couldn't push him through against his will. Why didn't he come after her when he found out she had gone? Didn't he know where to look?" "Just because he knew," said Jake. Saltash moved abruptly. "Damnation! You shall have what you've come for. If seeing is believing, then you shall believe that even Charles Burchester can protect a girl at a pinch from the snares of the virtuous." He pulled an envelope from an inner pocket and flung it with a passionate gesture upon the table in front of Jake. Jake's eyes, red brown and steady, marked the action, and contemplated him thereafter for several silent seconds. Then at length, very slowly: "Maybe, after all, I don't need to see my lord," he said. "Maybe I've made a mistake." He spoke with the utmost quietness, but his manner had undergone a change. It held a hint of deference. He made no move to touch the envelope on the table. Saltash's brows went up. "Satisfied?" he questioned curtly. "On that point, yes." Jake continued to look at him with a close and searching regard. "Not on all points?" Saltash flicked the ash from his cigarette with a movement of exasperation. Jake turned and slowly walked to the window. There fell a silence between them. He stood staring down upon the scene that Toby had gazed upon a little earlier, but he saw nothing of it. The hardness had gone out of his face, and a deep compassion had taken its place. Saltash continued to smoke for several restless seconds. Finally he dropped the end of his cigarette into a tray and spoke. "Anything more I can do for you?" Jake wheeled in his massive way and came back. "Say," he said slowly, "I'm kind of sorry for that little girl." Saltash made an abrupt movement that passed unexplained. "Well?" he said. Jake faced him squarely. "If I'd been at home," he said, "this would never have happened. Or if it had happened, he paused. "You'd have made a point of coming to the wedding?" suggested Saltash. Jake passed the suggestion by. "I'd have known how to deal with it, anyway. Now, it seems, it's too late." Saltash took up the envelope from the table, and returned it to his pocket. "I believe you'd have been better pleased if I hadn't married her," he observed. Jake shook his head. "I'd be better pleased, maybe, if I knew for certain what you did it for." "My good Jake, I don't go in for aims and motives," protested Saltash. "Call it a marriage of convenience if you feel that way. It's all the same to me." Jake's brows contracted. "I'd give a good deal not to call it that," he said. Saltash laughed. "Call it what you like. A whim, a fancy, the craze of the moment. You needn't waste any sentiment over it. I'm sorry about Bunny, but, if he hadn't been an ass, it wouldn't have happened. You can't blame me for that, anyhow. You did the same thing yourself." "I?" The red-brown eyes suddenly shone. "I don't follow you," said Jake deliberately. "You married your wife to deliver her from a fate you deemed unsuitable." Saltash's teeth showed for a moment in answer to the gleam in Jake's eyes. "You did it in an almighty hurry, too." "But, damn it, she needed protection," Jake said. "And, at least, I loved her." Saltash bowed. "Hence your motive was an entirely selfish one. My wife, au contraire, is quite unhampered by a husband's devotion. I have never made love to her yet. I have only protected her." He paused, and suddenly the old monkey-like look of mischief flashed back into his face. "I lay claim to the higher virtue, Jake," he said. "Heaven alone knows how long it will last. I've never scored over you before, but on this occasion—" He stopped with a careless wave of the hand. "Yes," Jake said, "on this occasion you've got me beat. But I didn't fight for my own sake, nor yet for the off chance of downing you, which I own would have given me considerable pleasure once. It was for the child's sake." An unwonted note of entreaty suddenly sounded in his voice. "I don't know what your game is, my lord, but she's yours now, to make or break. For God's sake, be decent to her, if you can." "If I can." Saltash clapped a sudden hand upon Jake's shoulder, but though the action was obviously a kindly one, it held restraint as well. "Do you think I don't know how to make a woman happy, Jake? Think I haven't studied the subject hard enough? Think I'm a fool at the game?" Jake looked him straight in the face. "No, I don't think you a fool, my lord," he said. "But I reckon there's one or two things that even you may have to learn. You've never yet made any woman permanently happy. There's only one way of doing that. Bunny would have done it, and won out, too. But you, I'm not so sure of you." "Oh, Bunny would have won out, would he?" Saltash's hand closed like a trap upon Jake's shoulder. There was a challenging quality in his smile. Jake nodded. "Yes, Bunny's got the real stuff in him. Bunny would have put her happiness before his own always. He would have given her the love that lasts. It's the only thing worth having, after all." "Well?" The challenge became more marked upon the swarthy face. The smile had vanished. "And you think I am incapable of that?" "I haven't said so," Jake said somberly. "But it's up to me to prove it." There was a certain insistence in Saltash's tone, albeit a mocking spirit looked out of his eyes. Jake faced it unwaveringly for several seconds. Then, "Yes, I reckon it is up to you," he said, and turned deliberately away. "I'm going now." "All right." Saltash's hand fell. "I give you credit for one thing, Jake," he said. "You haven't offered to take her off my hands. For that piece of forbearance I congratulate you. Do you want to see her before you go?" "Not specially," said Jake. Saltash's eyes followed him with a look half malicious, half curious. "Nor to send her a message?" he questioned. "No." Jake's tone was brief. "You're not wanting to offer her a safe harbor when her present anchorage fails her?" jested Saltash. Jake turned at the door as one goaded. "When that happens," he said very deliberately, "I guess she'll be past any help from me, poor kid." Saltash's black brows descended. He scowled hideously for a moment. Then, "I congratulate you again," he said coolly. "You are just beginning to see things as they are." Jake made a brief sound that might have indicated contempt, and opened the door. He went out with finality, and Saltash listened to the tread of his retreating feet with a grin of sheer cynical triumph. "So," he said lightly, "the villain scores at last." But as he turned towards the other room the cynicism passed from his face. He stood for a moment or two motionless at the door, then broke into a careless whistle, and opened it.
End of Part 4, Chapters 1 and 2. Part 4, Chapters 3 and 4 of Charles Rex by Ethel M. Dell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 3. A wife is different. Has he gone? Said Toby eagerly. She came into the room with a swift glance around. What did he say? What did he do? Was he angry? I really don't know, Saltash said, supremely unconcerned. He went. That's the main thing. Toby looked at him critically. You were so quiet, both of you. Was there a row? Were you listening? Said Saltash. She colored and smiled disarmingly. Part of the time. No, all the time. But I didn't hear anything, at least not much. Nothing that mattered. Are you angry? He frowned upon her, but his eyes reassured. I told you to smoke a cigarette. I'm sorry, said Toby meekly. Shall I smoke one now? He pinched her ear. No, we'll go out. You've got to shop. First, though, I've got something for you. I'm not sure you deserve it, but that's a detail. Few of us ever do get our deserts in this naughty world. What is it? Said Toby. Her bright eyes questioned him. She looked more than ever like an eager boy. He pulled a leather case out of his pocket and held it out to her. Oh, what is it? She said, and colored more deeply. You haven't been buying me things. Open it, said Saltash with regal peremptoriness. But still she hesitated, till he suddenly laid his hands on hers and compelled her. She saw a single string of pearls on a bed of blue velvet. Her eyes came up to his in quick distress. Oh, I ought not to take them, she said. And why not? She bit her lip almost as if she would burst into tears. Monseigneur. Call me Charles, he commanded. His hand still held hers. She dropped her eyes to them, and suddenly, very suddenly, she bent her head and kissed them. He started slightly, and in a moment he set her free, leaving the case in her hold. Eh bien, he said lightly, that is understood. You like my pearls, chérie? I love anything that comes from you, she made low reply. But these, I ought not to take these. But why not? He questioned. May I not make you a present? Are you not my wife? Yes, more faintly came Toby's answer. But a wife is different. A wife does not need presents. Mais vraiment, protested Saltash. So a wife is different? How different, mignonne? He tried to look into the downcast eyes, but she would not raise them. She was trembling a little. Such things as these, she said under her breath, are what a man would give to the woman he loves. And so you think they are unsuitable for my wife? Questioned Saltash, with a whimsical look on his dark face. She did not answer him, only mutely held out the case, still without looking at him. He stood for a second or two watching her, an odd flame coming and going in his eyes. Then abruptly he moved, picked up the pearls from their case, straightened them dexterously, and clasped them about her neck. She lifted her face then, quivering and irresolute, to his. And I can give you nothing, she said. He took her lightly by the shoulders as one who caresses a child. Ma chérie, you have given me already much more than you realize. But we will not go into that now. We will go to the shops. Afterwards we will go out to Fontainebleau and picnic in the forest. You will like that? Oh, so much, she said with enthusiasm. Yet there was a puzzled look of pain in her eyes as she turned away, and though she wore his pearls, she made no further reference to them. They went forth into the streets of Paris, and Toby shopped. At first she was shy, halting here and hesitating there, till Saltash, looking on careless and debonair, made it abundantly evident that whatever she desired she was to have, and then like a child on a holiday she flung aside all indecision and became eager and animated. So absorbed was she that she took no note of the passage of time, and was horrified when at length he called her attention to the fact that it was close upon the luncheon hour. "And you must be so tired of it all," she said with compunction. "Not in the least," he assured her airily between puffs of his cigarette.
It has been a new experience for me." Her eyes challenged him for a moment, and he laughed. "Mais oui, madame. I protest. A new experience. I feel I am doing my duty." "And it doesn't bore you?" questioned Toby, with a tilt of the chin. His look kindled a little. "If we were on board the old Night Moth, you'd have had a cuff for that," he remarked. "I wish we were," she said daringly. He flicked his fingers. "You're very young, Nonette." She shook her head with vehemence. "I'm not. I'm not. I'm only pretending. Can't you see?" He laughed jestingly. "You have never deceived me yet, ma chère. Not once, from the moment I found you shivering in my cabin, up to the present. You couldn't if you tried." Toby's blue eyes suddenly shone with a hot light. "So sure of that?" she said quickly. "You read me so easily?" "Like a book," said Saltash, with an arrogance but half assumed. "I cheated you once," she said, breathing sharply. "And I caught you," said Saltash. Only because I meant you to," said Toby under her breath. He raised his brows in momentary surprise, and in a flash she laughed and clapped her hands. "I had you there, King Charles. You see you are but a man after all." He gave her a swift and piercing glance. "And what are you?" he said. Her eyes fell swiftly before his look. She made no reply. They returned to the hotel and lunched together. The incident of the morning seemed to be forgotten. Jake's name was not once mentioned between them. Toby was full of gaiety. The prospect of the run to Fontainebleau evidently filled her with delight. She joined Saltash in the vestibule after the meal, clad in a light blue wrap they had purchased that morning. He went to meet her, a quick gleam in his eyes, and a man to whom he had been talking, a slim, foreign-looking man with black moustache and imperial, turned sharply and gave her a hard stare. Toby's chin went up. She looked exclusively at Saltash. Her bearing at that moment was that of a princess. "The car is ready?" she questioned. "Shall we go?" "By all means," said Saltash. He nodded a careless farewell to the other man, and followed her, a smile twitching at his lips, the gleam still in his eyes. "That man is Spentoli, the sculptor," he said, as he handed her into the car. "A genius, Nonette. I should have presented him to you if you had not been so haughty." "I hate geniuses," said Toby briefly. He laughed at her. "Mais vraiment? How many have you known?" She considered for a moment, and finally decided that the question did not require an answer. Saltash took the wheel and spun the little car round with considerable dexterity. "Yes, a genius," he said. "One of the most wonderful of the age. His work is amazing, scarcely human. He paints, too. All Paris raves over his work, with reason. His picture, 'The Victim'." He looked at her suddenly. "What is the matter, chérie? Is the sun too strong for you?" Toby's hand was shielding her eyes. Her lips were trembling. "Don't wait," she murmured. "Don't wait. Let's get away. I am all right. Just a little giddy, that's all." He took her at her word and sent the car swiftly forward. They passed out into the crowded thoroughfare, and in a moment or two Toby leaned back, gazing before her with a white, set face. Saltash asked no question. He did not even look at her, concentrating all his attention upon the task of extricating himself as swiftly as possible from the crush of vehicles around them. It was a day of perfect autumn, and Paris lay basking in sunshine. But Saltash was a rapid traveler at all times, and it was not long before Paris was left behind. But even when free from the traffic he did not speak or turn towards his companion, merely gave himself to the task of covering the ground as quickly as possible. In the end it was Toby who spoke, abruptly, boyishly. "By Jingo, you can drive!" Saltash's face showed its own elastic grin. "You like this?" "Rather," said Toby with enthusiasm. She threw off her silence and plunged forthwith into careless chatter, a mood to which he responded with the utmost readiness. When at length they ran into the shade of the forest they were both in the highest spirits. They had their tea in a mossy glade out of sight of the road. The sun was beginning to slant. Its rays fell in splashes of golden green all about them. "Just the place for a duel," said Saltash appreciatively. "Have you ever fought a duel?" Toby looked at him over the picnic basket with eyes of sparkling interest. She had thrown aside her hat, and her fair hair gleamed as if it gave forth light. Saltash leaned his shoulders against a tree and watched her. "I have never fought to kill," he said. "Honor is too easily satisfied in this country. Though, after all," his smile was suddenly provocative, "there are very few things worth fighting for, Nonette." Her eyes flashed their ready challenge. "Life being too short already?" she suggested. "Even so," said Charles Rex, coolly. Toby abruptly bent her head and muttered something into the picnic basket. "What?" said Saltash. She pulled out a parcel of cakes and tossed them on the ground. "Nothing," she said. He leaned forward unexpectedly as she foraged for more, and gripped the small brown hand. "Tell me what you said," he commanded. She flung him a look half frightened, half daring. "I said there was only one cup." She would have released her hand with the words, but his fingers tightened like a spring. "Pardonnez moi, that was not what you said." She became passive in his hold, but she said nothing. "Tell me what you said," Saltash said again. A little tremor went through Toby. "Can we do with only one cup?" she asked, not looking at him, her eyelids flickering nervously. "Going to answer me?" said Saltash. She shook her head, and was silent. He waited for perhaps 10 seconds, and in that time a variety of different expressions showed and vanished on his ugly face. Then, just as Toby was beginning to tremble in real trepidation, he suddenly set her free. "We have drunk out of the same glass before now," he said. "We can do it again." She looked at him then, relief and doubt struggling together in her eyes. "Are you angry?" she said. His answering look baffled her. "No," he said. She laid a conciliatory hand upon his arm. "You are. I am sure you are." "I am not," said Saltash. "Then why aren't you?" demanded Toby with sudden spirit. The monkeyish grin leapt into his face. "Because I know what you said," he told her coolly. "It is not easy, you will never find it easy, to deceive me." She snatched her hand away. Her face was on fire. "I said you did not make the most of life," she flung at him. "And it's true. You don't. You don't." "How do you know that?" said Saltash. She did not answer him. Her head was bent over the basket. She threw out one thing after another with nervous rapidity, and once, as he watched her, there came a faint sound that was like a hastily suppressed sob. Saltash got to his feet with disconcerting suddenness and walked away. When he returned some minutes later with a half-smoked cigarette between his lips, she was sitting demurely awaiting him, the picnic ready spread. He scarcely looked at her, but flicked her cheek as he sat down, and in a moment she turned and smiled at him. "I have found another cup," she said. "So I see," said Saltash, and before she could realize his mood, he picked it up and flung it at the trunk of a tree some yards away. It shivered in fragments on the moss, and Toby gasped and stared at him wide-eyed. He laughed in his careless fashion at her amazement. "Now we shall drink out of one cup," he said. Was that why you did it?" she stammered breathlessly. He blew a cloud of smoke into the air with a gesture of royal indifference. "Even so, madame," he said. "One does these things with a wife. You see, a wife is different." I see," said Toby. 4. The Idol of Paris. It was dark when they returned to the hotel, but Paris shone with a million lights. The hotel itself had a festive air. There were flowers in all directions, and a red carpet had been laid upon the steps. "Roselle d'Aubigny is expected," said Saltash. "Who?" Toby stopped short in the act of descending. Her face shone white in the glare. A moment before she had been laughing, but the laugh went into her question with a little choked sound. "Who did you say?" she questioned more coherently. "Mademoiselle d'Aubigny, the idol of Paris. Never heard of her?" Saltash handed her lightly down. "She is coming to a dance in the great salon to night. You shall see her. She is a thing to remember."
Toby gave a quick shiver. "Yes, I have heard of her too much. Too much. I don't want to see her. Shall we dine upstairs?"
"Oh, I think not," said Saltash, with decision. "You are too retiring, ma chère. It doesn't become a lady of your position." He followed her towards the lift. The vestibule was full of people, laughing and talking, awaiting the coming of the favourite. But as the girl in her blue cloak went through, a sudden hush fell. Women lifted glasses to look at her, and men turned to watch. Saltash sauntered behind her in his regal way, looking neither to right nor left, yet fully aware of all he passed. No one accosted him. There were times when even those who knew him well would have hesitated to do so. He could surround himself with an atmosphere so suavely impersonal as to be quite impenetrable to all. It surrounded him now. He walked like a king through a crowd of courtiers, and the buzz of talk did not spring up again till he was out of sight. "So you do not want to see la première danseuse du siècle," he commented, as he entered the sitting room of their suite behind Toby. She turned, blue eyes wide with protest in her white face. "Do you wish me to see her, my lord? That woman?" He frowned upon her suddenly. "Call me Charles. Do you hear? We will play this game according to rule, or not at all." "You are angry," Toby said, and turned still whiter. He came to her, thrust a quick arm about her. "I am not angry, mignonne, at least not with you. But you must take your proper place. I can't keep you in hiding here. Those gaping fools downstairs, they have got to understand. You are not my latest whim, but a permanent institution. You are my wife." She shivered in his hold, but she clung to him. "I don't feel like a permanent institution," she told him rather piteously. "And when you are angry—" "I am not angry," said Saltash, and tweaked her ear as though she had been a boy. "But, whether you feel like it or not, you are my wife, and you have got to play the part. C'est entendu, n'est-ce pas?" "Whatever you wish," said Toby faintly. He set her free. "You must look your best to night. Wear blue. It is your colour. I shall present Spentoli to you. And to morrow he will want to paint you." Toby stiffened. "That canaille?" she said. He looked at her in surprise. "What is the matter with you to night, Nonette? You are hating all the world." Her blue eyes blazed. "I don't want to meet Spentoli," she said. "He has an evil eye. I look to you to protect me." "My good child," said Saltash. He turned aside to light a cigarette, and there was a pause. But Toby still stood rigid, as it were on guard. He spoke again after a moment, and his voice was kind, though it had a certain dominant quality also. "Nonette, you need not be afraid when you are with me. I shall protect you. Now go and dress. When you are ready, come to me for inspection. And remember, you are to look your best to night." He turned with the last words and looked at her. His brows went up as he realized her attitude, the tense resistance of the slight figure withstanding him. But it was only for a moment or two that the girl maintained her stand. At sight of the look that leaped to his eyes her own were swiftly lowered. She drew back from him. "I will do whatever you wish," she said again, nervously. "You know that." "Yes, I know that," said Saltash, with his quick grimace. "You have my sympathy, Nonette. Now go, ma chère, go." She went from his presence like a small hunted animal. Saltash shrugged his shoulders and sauntered down again to the vestibule. The crowd had grown. They were watching the great entrance door expectantly for the coming of the celebrated dancer. Saltash called for a drink and mingled with the throng. The Italian, Spentoli, came up presently and joined him. "I am hoping," he said, "that you will presently give me the great honour of presenting me to your bride." Saltash looked at him. Spentoli was one of the very few men for whom he entertained respect. The Italian's work had always held an immense attraction for his artistic soul, and he had never troubled to disguise the fact. "My wife is young and shy," he said after a moment. "I will present you some day, Spentoli, but it may not be yet." "This is her first visit to Paris?" questioned Spentoli. "Not her first. But she does not know Paris well." Saltash spoke carelessly. "I am not showing her everything at once. I think that is a mistake." "That is true," agreed Spentoli. "The freshness of youth is gone all too soon. But she will be superbly beautiful in a few years' time. Will you permit me to congratulate you on the excellence of your choice?" Saltash grimaced. "Do we ever choose?" he said. "Do we not rather receive gifts as the gods send us, in more or less of a grudging spirit?" Spentoli smiled. "I did not think you would marry one so young," he said. "She has the athletic look of a boy. She reminds me " "Of a picture called 'The Victim,' by one Spentoli." Saltash's voice was suave. "A cruel picture, mon ami, but of an amazing merit. I have seen the likeness also. Where did you get it?" The Italian was still smiling, but his eyes were wary. "From a little circus rider in California," he said. "A child, an imp of a child, astonishingly clever, a wisp of inspiration. Yes, a girl, of course, but she had all the lines of a boy, the perfect limbs of an athlete. I took her from her circus. I should have paid her well had she remained with me. But before the picture was finished she was tired. She was a little serpent, wily and wicked. One day we had a small discussion in my studio — oh, quite a small discussion — and she stuck her poison fang into me and fled." Spentoli's teeth gleamed through his black moustache. "I do not like these serpent women," he said. "When I meet her again it will be my turn to strike." "Our turn so seldom comes," said Saltash lazily, his eyes wandering to the door. "Mademoiselle Rosel, for instance, would hold her own against any of us." "Ah, Rosel!" Spentoli's face changed magically. "But she is beautiful, and without venom. A rose without a thorn." Saltash's mouth twitched mockingly. "And without a heart also," he suggested. "She is all a heart," cried Spentoli, with flashing eyes. Saltash laughed aloud. "That also is sometimes the drawback, mon ami. I gather she is the attraction who has drawn you here." "She draws all the world," said Spentoli. And with that he sprang to his feet, for there was a general stir in the vestibule, such as might herald the coming of a queen. In a moment the buzz of voices died down, and a great silence fell. Saltash remained seated, a certain arrogance in his pose, though his eyes also watched the door. There came the sound of a laugh, a clear, ringing laugh, childishly, irresistibly gay; and a figure in blue came in through the marble pillars. As a queen they had prepared for her, and as a queen she entered, a being so exquisite, so goddess like, that every breath was drawn in wonder. She looked around her with eyes that shone like sapphires; her red lips were parted. She had the expectant look of girlhood, yet her beauty had a quality unknown to youth. And it was to that quality, almost unknown to himself, that Saltash did homage as he rose. Her look flashed across to him, comprehended his action, and laughed open triumph. Then, with a suddenness almost too swift to follow, she turned to a man who had entered behind her and softly spoke. Saltash's eyes went to the man, and he drew a low whistle between his teeth. It was well known that Rosel d'Aubigny never travelled without an escort. But this man! He was tall and broad, and he carried himself with a supreme contempt for his fellow men. He did not look at Saltash, did not apparently even see the hushed crowd that hung upon every movement of that wonderful woman creature who took the world by storm wherever she went. He was superbly indifferent to his surroundings, gazing straight before him with the eyes of a Viking who searches the far horizon. He walked with the free swing of a pirate. And as the woman turned her dazzling face towards him, it was plain to all that she saw none but him in that vast and crowded place. He was by her side as they moved forward, and they saw her lightly touch his arm with an intimate gesture, as though they were alone. Then the whole throng broke into acclamations, and the spell was broken. She saw them all again, and laughed her gracious thanks. The great hall rang with their greeting as she passed through, but no one sought to detain her, and she did not pause. Later she would give them all they desired, but her moment had not arrived.
So she went on to the great curving staircase, side by side with her fair bearded Viking, still laughing like a happy child who looks for the morrow. As she rounded the curve of the stair, she snatched a red rose from her breast, and threw it down to her worshippers below. It was aimed at Saltash, but it fell before Spentoli, and he caught and held it with wild adoration leaping in his eyes. As he pressed it to his lips, he was sobbing. "Mon ami," said Saltash's voice behind him, maliciously humorous, "you have stolen my property. But, since I have no use for it, you may keep it." Spentoli looked at him with burning eyes. "Ah, you may laugh," he said in a fierce undertone. "You are without a soul." "Isn't it better to laugh?" queried Saltash. "Did you expect a blow in the face?" Spentoli glared for a moment, and recovered himself. "Do you know what they are saying of her?" he said. "They say that she is dying. But it is not true, not true. Such a beauty as that, such a loveliness, could never die." The cynical lines in Saltash's face deepened very perceptibly. He shrugged his shoulders and said nothing. "Who is the man with her?" demanded Spentoli. "I have never seen him before. The man with the face of a Dane. Do you know him?" "Yes, I know him," said Saltash. "Then who is he? Some new lover?" There was suppressed eagerness in the question. Spentoli's eyes were smoldering again. Saltash was looking supremely ironical. "Perhaps new," he said. "More likely very old. His name is Larpent, and he is the captain of my yacht." End of Part 4, Chapters 3 and 4. Part 4, Chapters 5 and 6 of Charles Rex by Ethel M. Dell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 5. The Dance of Death. "We will watch from the gallery," said Saltash. Toby looked up at him with quick gratitude. "There won't be so many people there," she said. He frowned at her, but his look was quizzical. "But everyone will know that Lady Saltash is present, with her husband," he said. She slipped a persuasive hand onto his arm. "King Charles," she said, "let us leave Paris." "Bored?" said Saltash. Her face was slightly drawn. "No, no. Only—" She paused. Then suddenly flashed him her swift smile. "Let it be as you wish," she said. He flicked her cheek in his careless, caressing way. "Shall I tell you something, mignonne? We are going very soon." Her eyes shone, more blue than the frock she wore. She stooped impulsively, and touched his hand with her lips, then, as though she feared to anger him, drew quickly away. "Shall we go on to the yacht?" she asked, eagerness half suppressed in her voice. "Yes," said Saltash, and he spoke with finality, even with a certain grimness. Toby's face lighted up for a second, and then clouded again. She glanced at him doubtfully. "If Paris amuses you," she ventured. "Paris does not amuse me," said Saltash emphatically. "Have a cigarette, ma chère, while I go and dress." "Can I help you dress?" said Toby, with a touch of wistfulness. "I have put everything ready." His odd eyes flashed her a smile. "Not here, chérie, not now. Perhaps when we get on the yacht again." He was gone, leaving the sentence unfinished, leaving Toby looking after him with the wide eyes of one who sees at last a vision long desired. She stretched out both her arms as the door closed upon him, and her lips repeated very softly the words that he had last uttered. "Perhaps when we got on a yacht again." When they went down to the great salle à manger, a little later, her face was flushed and her smile ready, though she glanced about her in a shy, half furtive fashion as they entered. They found a secluded table reserved for them in a corner, and her eyes expressed relief. She shrank into it as if she would make herself as small as possible. Again no one accosted them, though a good many looked in their direction. Saltash was far too well known a figure to pass unnoticed in any fashionable crowd. But the general attention did not center upon them. That was absorbed by a far greater attraction that night. She sat at the end of the room like a queen holding her court, and beside her sat the Viking, stern-faced and remote of mien, as supremely isolated as though he sat with her on a desert island. He spoke but seldom, and then to her exclusively; but when he spoke, she turned to him the radiant face of the woman who holds within her grasp her heart's desire. She was superbly dressed in many shaded blue, and jewels sparkled with every breath she drew. Above her forehead there nestled in the gold of her hair a single splendid diamond that burned like a multicolored flame. She was at the acme of her triumph that night. Of all who knew her there was not one who had seen her thus. They watched her almost with bated breath. She was like a being from another world. She transcended every expectation of her. The band played only dance music by her desire, it was said; but such music as wrought irresistibly upon the senses and emotions. She was preparing her audience for what should follow. Throughout the meal excitement was steadily rising. There was almost a feeling of delirium in the air. Before the bulk of diners had finished, she rose to go. Her cavalier rose with her, flinging her gauzy wrap of blue and gold over his arm. It was the signal for a demonstration. In a moment a youth with eyes ablaze with adoration sprang on to a table in the centre of the vast room, with a glass of red wine held high. "Arroselle! Arroselle!" The cry went up to the domed roof in a great crescendo of sound, and instantly the place was a pandemonium of shouting, excited figures. They crowded towards the table at which the danseuse still stood. And just for a second, one fleeting second, her eyes showed a curious fear. She stood almost as one at a loss. Then, in a flash, her irresolution was gone. Her beautiful face smiled its own inimitable smile. The music of her laughter rang silvery through the tumult. She made a dainty gesture of acceptance, of acknowledgment, of friendly appreciation; then lightly she turned to go. Her companion made a path for her. He looked as if he could have hewn his way through a wall of rock at that moment, and his uncompromising bearing gained him respect. No one attempted to gainsay him. They were gone almost before they realized that their idol had not spoken a word to them. The moment was past, and the excitement died down to a buzz of talk. "An amazing woman," said Saltash. Toby glanced at him and said nothing. She had watched the whole episode from her corner with eyes that missed nothing, but she had not spoken a word. He bent suddenly towards her. "Drink some wine, chérie. You are pale." She started a little at the quick peremptoriness of his speech. She lifted her glass to drink, and splashed some of the wine over. He leaned farther forward, screening her from observation. "Go on, drink," he said with insistence, and in a moment his hand closed upon hers, guiding the wine to her lips. She drank obediently, not meeting his look, and he took the glass from her and set it down. "Now we will go. Are you ready?" She rose, and he stood aside for her. As she passed him, his hand closed for an instant upon her bare arm in a grasp that was close and vital. She threw him a quick upward glance, but still she said no word. They passed out through the throng of diners almost unobserved, but in the corridor Spentoli leaned against a pillar smoking a long black cigar. He made no movement to intercept them, but his eyes with their restless fire dwelt upon the girl in a fashion that drew her own irresistibly. She saw him, and slightly paused. It was the pause of the hunted animal that sees its retreat cut off, but in an instant Saltash's voice, very cool, arrogantly self-assured, checked the impulse to panic. "Straight on to the lift, ma chère. See, it is there in front of you. There will be no one in the gallery. Go straight on." She obeyed him, instinctively as her habit was, but in the lift she trembled so much that he made her sit down. He stood beside her in silence, but once lightly his hand touched her cheek. She moved then, swiftly, convulsively, and caught it in both her own. But the next moment he had gently drawn it free. The gallery that ran round three sides of the great salon was deserted. There was only one point at the far end whence a view of the stage that had been erected for the dancer could be obtained. Towards this Saltash turned. "We shall see her from here," he said. The place was but dimly illumined by the flare of the many lights below, two great crystal candelabra that hung at each end being left unlighted. Under one of these was a settee which Saltash drew forward to the balcony. "No one will disturb us here," he said. "We can smoke in peace." He offered her his cigarette case, but she refused it nervously, sitting down in a corner of the settee in the crouched attitude of a frightened creature seeking cover. The band was playing in the salon now, and people were beginning to crowd in. Saltash leaned back in his corner and smoked. His eyes went to and fro ceaselessly, yet the girl beside him was aware of a scrutiny as persistent as if they never left her. She sat in silence, clasping and unclasping her hands, staring downwards at the shining stage. Very soon the salon was full of people, and the lights were lowered there, while on the stage only a single shaft of blinding violet light remained, shooting downwards from the center. Toby's eyes became fixed upon that shaft of light. She seemed to have forgotten to breathe. The band had ceased to play. There fell a potent silence. The multitude below sat motionless, as if beneath a spell. And then she came. No one saw her coming. She arrived quite suddenly, as though she had slid down that shaft of light. And she was there before them, dancing, dancing like a winged thing in the violet radiance. Not a sound broke the stillness save a single wandering thread of melody that might have come from a throat of a bird. Soft, fitful, but half awake in the dawning. The violet light was merging imperceptibly into rose, the unutterable rose of the early morning. It caught the dancing figure, and she lifted her beautiful face to it and laughed. The gauzy scarf streamed out from her shoulders like a flame, curving, mounting, sinking, now enveloping the white arms, now flung wide in a circle of glittering splendor. A vast breath went up from the audience. She held them as by magic, all save one, who leaned back in his corner with no quickening of the pulses, and watched the girl beside him sitting motionless with her blue eyes wide and fixed, as though they gazed upon some horror from which there was no escape. The rose light deepened to crimson. She was dancing now in giddy circles like a many-colored moth dazzled by the dawn. The melody was growing. Other bird voices were swelling into sound, a wild and flute-like music of cadences that came and went, elusive as the laughter of wood-nymphs in an enchanted glade. And every one of that silent crowd of watchers saw the red light of dawn breaking through the trees of a dream forest that no human foot had ever trod. Slowly the crimson lightened. The day was coming, and the silent flitting moth of night was turning into a butterfly of purest gold. The scarf still floated about her like a gold-edged cloud. The giddy whirl was over. She came to rest, poised, quivering in the light of the newly risen sun, every line of her exquisite body in the accord of a perfect symmetry. Yes, she was amazing. She was unique. Wherever she went, the spell still held. But tonight she was as one inspired. She did not see her spellbound audience. She was dancing for one alone. She was as a woman who waits for her lover. In some fashion this fact communicated itself to her worshippers. They guessed that somewhere near that dazzling figure the stranger whom no one knew was watching. Insensibly, through the medium of the dancer, his presence made itself felt. When that wonderful dance of the dawn was over, and the thunder of applause had died away, they looked around, asking who and where he was. But no one knew, and though curiosity was rife, it seemed unlikely that it would be satisfied that night. Up in the gallery Toby drew a deep breath as one of coming out of a trance, and turned towards the man beside her. The light had been turned on in the salon below, and it struck upwards on her face, showing it white and weary. "She has found another victim," she said. "It seems so," said Saltash. She looked at him in the dimness. "Did you know that Captain Larpent was with her?" "No," said Saltash. He leaned forward abruptly, meeting her look with a sudden challenge. "Did you?" She drew back sharply. "Of course not. Of course not. What should I know about her?" He leaned back again without comment, and lighted another cigarette. At the end of several seconds of silence, Toby spoke again, her locked fingers pulling against each other nervously. "I wonder, do you mind, if I go soon? I am rather tired." The lights went out as she spoke, and Saltash's face became invisible. He spoke quite kindly, but with decision, out of the darkness. "After this dance, ma chère, if you desire it." The music began. Weird and mournful, and a murmur went round among the eager watchers. It was her most famous dance. The dance of death, the most gruesome spectacle, so it was said, that any dancer had ever conceived. She came on to the stage like the flash of an arrow, dressed in black, that glittered and scintillated with every amazing movement. And then it began, that most wonderful dance of hers that all the world was mad to see. It was almost too rapid for the eye to follow in its first stages, a fever of movement, a delirium indescribable, a fantasy painful to watch, but from which no watcher could turn away. Even Saltash, who had taken small interest in the previous dance, leaned forward and gave his full attention to this, as it were in spite of himself. The very horror of it was magnetic. They seemed to look upon a death struggle, the wild fight of a creature endowed with a fiery vitality against an enemy unseen, but wholly ruthless, and from the first invincible. Those who saw that dance of Roselle d'Aubigny never forgot it, and there was hardly a woman in the audience who was not destined to shudder whenever the memory of it arose. It was arresting, revolting, terrible. It must have compelled in any case. A good many began to sob with the sheer nervous horror of it, yearning for the end upon which they were forced to look, though with a dread that made the blood run cold. But the end was such as no one in that assembly looked for. Just as the awful ecstasy of the dance was at its height, just as the dreaded crisis approached, and they saw with a gasping horror the inevitable final clutch of the unseen enemy upon his vanquished victim, just as she lifted her face in the last anguish of supplication, yielding the last hope, sinking in nerveless surrender before the implacable destroyer, there came a sudden flare of light in the salon, and the great crystal candelabra that hung over the end of the gallery where the man and the girl were seated watching became a dazzling sparkle of overwhelming light. Everyone turned towards it instinctively, and Toby, hardly knowing what she did, but with the instinct to escape strong upon her, leapt to her feet. In that moment, as she stood in the full light, the dancer's eyes also shot upwards and saw the slim young figure. It was only for a moment, but instantly a wild cry rang through the great salon, a cry of agony so piercing that women shrieked and trembled, hiding their faces from what they knew not what. In the flash of a second the light was gone, the gallery again in the darkness. But on the stage a woman's voice cried thrice, "Toinette! Toinette! Toinette!" in the anguished accents of a mother who cries for her dead child, and then fell into a tragic silence more poignant than any sound, a silence that was as the silence of death. And in that silence a man's figure, moving with the free athletic swing of a sailor, crossed the stage to where the dancer lay huddled in the dimness like a broken thing, lifted her, bore her away. 6. The New Lover. Very late that night, when all the crowd who had assembled to watch Roselle d'Aubigny had dispersed with awestruck whisperings, two men came down the great staircase into the empty vestibule and paused at the foot. "You are leaving Paris again?" said Saltash. The other nodded, his face perfectly emotionless, his eyes the eyes of a sailor who searches the far horizon. "There is nothing to keep me here," he said, and absently accepted a cigarette from the case that Saltash proffered. "I have always hated towns. I only came—" He stopped, considered a moment, and said no more. Saltash's eyes were upon him, alert, speculative, but wholly without malice. "You came because you were sent for," he said. Larpent nodded twice thoughtfully, more as if in an answer to some mental suggestion than as if the words had been actually uttered. He struck a match and held it for Saltash. Then, as he deliberately lighted his own cigarette between slow puffs, he spoke. "There was only one reason on earth that would have brought me." "Yes?" said Saltash. He dropped into a chair with the air of a man who has limitless leisure at his disposal, but his tone was casual. He did not ask for confidence. Larpent stood still gazing before him through the smoke with keen, unwavering eyes. "Only one reason," he said again, and still he seemed to speak as one who communes with his inner soul. "She was dying, and she wanted me." He paused a moment, and an odd tremor went through him. "After 20 years," he said, as if in wonder at himself. Saltash's look came swiftly upwards. "I've heard that before," he said. "Those she caught, she kept, always. No other woman was ever worth while after Roselle." Larpent's hand clenched instinctively, but he said nothing. Saltash went on in the same casual tone. "She never caught me, mon ami. I met her too late in life, when I was beginning to get fastidious." His monkey-like grin showed for a moment. "I appreciated her charm, but it left me cold." "You never saw her in her first youth," said Larpent, and into his fixed eyes there came a curious glow, the look of a man who sees a vision. "What was she like, then?" said Saltash. Slowly the sailor answered him, word by word, as one spelling out a strange language. "She was like a butterfly that plays among the flowers in the early morning. She had the look of a boy. The wide open eyes, the fearless way, the freedom, the daring. Her innocence, her loveliness." Something rose unexpectedly in his throat. He stopped and swallowed hard. "My God, how lovely she was!" he said in a strangled voice. Saltash got up in his sudden elastic fashion. "Look here, you want a drink. Sit down while I get you one." He was gone with the words, not waiting for the half-uttered remonstrance that the other man sent after him. Larpent stood staring heavily before him for a space, then turned with a mechanical movement and dropped into a chair. He was sitting so, bent forward, his hands clasped in front of him, when Saltash returned. He had the worn, grey look of a man tired out with hard travel. Saltash poured out a drink and held it down to him. "Here's the stuff. Drink, man. It'll put new life into you." Larpent drank, still in that slow, mechanical fashion. But as he drained the glass his eyes met Saltash's alert look, and a faint, grim smile crossed his haggard features. "Don't let me spoil your holiday, my lord," he said. "Don't be a damn fool," said Saltash. Larpent sat in silence for several seconds. Then in a more normal tone he spoke again. "I had to come to her. God knows what made her want me after all these years. But I couldn't refuse to come. I had her message 2 days ago. She said she was alone. Dying. So I came." He paused and wiped his forehead. "I thought she had tricked me. You saw her as she was to-night. She was like that, full of life, superb. But I had come to her, and I found I couldn't leave her. She wanted me to take her back." He got up, but not with any agitation, and began to pace to and fro as though he paced a deck. "You will think me mad, of course. You never came under the spell. But I was first with her. And perhaps it was fitting that I should be the last. Had she lived, after to-night, I would have taken her away. She would never have danced again. I would have taken her out of this damnable world that had dragged her down. I'd have saved her somehow." "You wouldn't," said Saltash. "It's like a recurrent fever. You'd never have held her." "I say I would." Larpent spoke deeply, but still without emotion. "I could have done it, and no one else on earth. I tell you I was first with her, and a woman doesn't forget the first. I had a power that no other man ever possessed, or ever could possess. I was her husband." "What?" said Saltash. Larpent paced on with bent head. "I was her husband. But I was at sea and she was on shore. And so I lost her. She was not made to stand against temptation. It came to her when I was on the other side of the world. When I got back, she was gone. And I never followed her. The thing was hopeless. She was that sort, you understand. It was first one, and then another with her. I dropped her out of my life and let her go. I didn't realize then, what I know now, that the power to rescue and to hold her was mine. If I had, I might have gone after her.
I can't say. But I was too bitter at the time to feel it was worth while. I went back to the sea and left her to work out her own damnation." "And yet you loved her," Saltash said, with a queer twist of the features that was not of mirth. "I loved her, yes. If I hadn't loved her I would never have come to her when she called. That is love, the thing that doesn't die." A sudden throb sounded in Larpin's voice. He paused for a moment in his walk, then paced on. "You may laugh at it, call it what you will, but there is a power on the earth that is stronger than anything else, and when that power speaks we have got to obey. I didn't want to come. You think me a damn fool for coming. But I had to. That's all there is to it." "I don't think you any sort of a fool," Saltash threw in briefly. "You did the only thing possible." "Yes, the only thing. I came to her. If I hadn't come, she'd have died alone. But that alone wasn't why she sent for me. It was the primary reason, but not the only one. There was another." Larpin ceased his pacing and deliberately faced the man who stood listening. "You know what happened to night," he said. "That child, the Scaramouche you picked out of the gutter at Valrosa. Toby, do you realize, have you grasped, the meaning of that yet?" Saltash flung up his head with an arrogant gesture. "There is one thing about her you have not grasped," he said. "But go on. I may as well hear it." Larpin went on steadily. "When I came to her yesterday, she told me of a child that had been born to her, a child she had loved but had been unable to protect. It was a long story. Spentoli, the Italian artist, knows it from beginning to end. You know Spentoli?" "I know him," said Saltash. "Spentoli is a blackguard," Larpin said. "The sort that is born, not made afterwards. He has painted Roselle over and over again. He raves about her. He may be a genius. He is certainly mad. He wanted the child for a model, and Roselle could not prevent it. So she told me. I believe she was dependent upon him at the time. She had been ill. She has been ill for years with heart trouble. And so he had the child, but only for a time. The girl had a will of her own and broke away, joined a circus in California. He tracked her down, captured her again, tried to make a slave of her. But she was like a wild creature. She stabbed him one night and fled. That was Roselle's trouble. She had never been able to hear of her again. She begged me to find and save her. I promised to do my best. But there was no need to search very far. Tonight Spentoli pulled the wires again. It was he who switched on that light. It was he who killed Roselle. The girl in the gallery with you, Toby, was her daughter and mine. You heard Roselle cry out when she saw her. She never spoke again." Larpin ceased to speak. He was no longer looking at Saltash. The far vision seemed to have caught his gaze again. He stared beyond. Saltash watched him with working brows. "Are you wanting to lay claim to the girl?" he asked abruptly. Larpin's face was grim. "I make no claim, my lord," he said. "But I have sworn to do my best for her. I shall keep that oath of mine." "Meaning?" said Saltash. The sailor's look met his squarely. "You know what I mean," he said. Saltash began to grin. "A fight to a finish, what? I'm sorry, mon ami. But I've got you beaten at the start. Shall I tell you how you can best keep that somewhat rash oath of yours?" "Well?" The word fell brief and uncompromising. Larpin's face was as carved granite. Saltash thrust forth a sudden hand and took him by the shoulder. "Just by effacing yourself, mon vieux," he said lightly. "Go back to the Blue Moon, take her to Fair Harbor, and await my orders there." It was carelessly, even jestingly spoken, but a certain authority lurked behind the words. Charles Rex knew how to assert his kingship upon occasion, knew also how to temper it with a touch of friendship. Larpin's look did not waver, but some of the grimness went away from it. Neither anger nor indignation had any place here. He continued to look Saltash straight in the face. "And that would be keeping my oath," he said. "Even so. said Saltash. "You mean," Larpin spoke with slow emphasis, "that to leave her where she is now is to leave her in safe and honorable keeping?" The old mocking smile gleamed in Saltash's eyes. "Yes, I mean that," he said. "Do you believe me, Larpent?" "Believe you, my lord?" Larpent seemed to hesitate. The hand that held him moved with a hint of impatience. "I am asking," said Saltash royally, "if you consider that my protection is adequate for my wife." "Your wife?" Larpin started in sharp surprise. "Your wife, did you say?" Saltash broke into a chuckle and dropped his hand from his captain's shoulder. "Yes, just that," he said. "You are behind the times, my friend. Are you going to congratulate me? We were married 4 days ago." Larpin's hand came out to him abruptly. "It's the best thing you've ever done, my lord," he said. "And you will never regret it." "What makes you say that?" said Saltash curiously. Their hands gripped and fell apart. Larpin answered him in the brief fashion of the man whose words are few. "Mainly because you loved her enough to marry her when you could have had her without." Saltash's laugh had the old derisive ring, but there was no corresponding gleam of mockery in his eyes as he turned carelessly aside. "What is this thing called love?" he said. End of Part 4, Chapters 5 and 6. Part 4, Chapters 7, 8, and 9 of Charles Rex by Ethel M. Dell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 7. The Refugee. It was by no means characteristic of Jake to linger on a quest which had already proved fruitless, but he was a man who possessed acquaintances in almost all parts of the world, and Paris was no exception. For the rest of the day after leaving Saltash he was philosophically occupied in seeking out old friends. Eventually he dined at a restaurant, and betook himself to the station to catch the night train to Calais. It was all one to Jake whether he traveled by night or by day, so wholly accustomed was he to adapt himself to circumstances. Maud was wont to say with a smile that the luxuries of decent living were utterly thrown away upon him. He was a man who scarcely noticed physical discomfort. He could sleep under practically any conditions. Walking solidly down the platform, carrying his own baggage, his thoughts were completely astray from his surroundings. They had reverted to the memory of the girlish figure he had seen that morning seated on a table, swinging one leg in studied nonchalance while every line was instinct with defiance. Yes, she had defied him, but deep in her heart she had feared — how she had feared — that Saltash would fail to hold her against him. Again a deep compassion came over Jake, stirring the very depths of him. Poor little girl, flung to and fro as flotsam in the cruel surf of life's breakers. He had done his best to deliver her, but fate had been against him. Fate had ordained that she should be the victim of this man's caprice, the slave of impulses which might or might not be her destruction. It was as if he watched her trying to walk on a quicksand. And he was powerless to help her. Saltash had defeated him, and he had no insight into his motives. Unstable, baffling, irresponsible as a monkey that swings from tree to tree, he had snatched his prize, and even Jake, who knew him better than most, could only speculate as to whether he would carry it high above disaster, or tire and idly fling it away. Some vagrant sense of honor seemed to have actuated him so far, but never yet had he known such a motive to last for long. The man's face was beyond him, too fantastic for comprehension. He recognized that he was capable of greatness, but very few were the occasions on which he had achieved it. If the motive power were lacking in this instance, Toby's chances were indeed small. He found an empty carriage and threw his belongings on to a seat. The train was not a favorite one, and there would be no crowd. He had some minutes to wait, and he lighted his pipe and began to pace the platform unencumbered. A few travelers straggling by eyed him with some interest. He was not a man to be passed unnoticed. The massive, thick-set shoulders had a bulldog strength that must have marked him in any crowd. His height was unremarkable, but there was power in every dominant line of him. He had the free carriage of one accustomed to the wide places of the earth. He took small note of his fellow travelers, being engrossed in his own thoughts. He wondered how Maud would regard the situation, and half wished she had been with him to deal with it.
for Maud possessed undoubted influence over Saltash. He reflected that she was probably the only person in the world who did. He had strolled almost to the barrier, and was in the act of turning back, when some impulse for which he could not afterwards account, induced him to pause and take stock of the passengers passing through. The train was almost due to start, and there was some slight confusion and a quickening of feet on the platform. He realized that he ought to be going back to his own carriage, but something stayed him. He stood still, his keen eyes searching the hastening figures. And so standing, in a moment his attention was focused upon a girl in a blue cloak, who came towards him at a run, evidently intent upon catching the train. She passed him swiftly without seeing him, almost brushed against him. And behind her came a dark man with black moustache and imperial, following her closely with an air of proprietorship. Jake wheeled in his tracks, for a second amazed out of all composure. But an instant later he was in pursuit. He had had but a fleeting glimpse of her face, and the blue cloak was quite unfamiliar to him. But there was no mistaking the boyish freedom of her gait, the athletic swing of her as she turned and leaped into a compartment that her companion opened for her. The black-browed Italian was in the act of following when Jake arrived. The realization of another hand upon the door was the first intimation that reached him of the Englishman's presence. He turned and looked into a pair of red-brown eyes that regarded him with the utmost steadiness, as a quiet voice made slightly drawling explanation. "This lady is a friend of mine," said Jake Bolton. "I should like a word with her." The Italian looked murderous for a moment, but he gave ground almost in spite of himself. Perhaps the calm insistence of the other man's bearing warned him at the outset of the futility of attempting any other course of action. Jake was actually in the carriage before he could jerk out a word of protest. "Sapristi! You go too far," he blustered then. But Jake was already confronting the girl, who had started up at his coming and stood facing him white and shaken. He spoke, still quite quietly, even gently, but in the tone that no delinquent ever heard unmoved. "Say," he said, "are you playing the game?" She put up a hand to her throat. His sudden coming had unnerved her, and she had no words. But her quivering face and tragic eyes were more than sufficient answer for Jake. He had dealt with sudden emergencies before, and he treated this one with characteristic decision. "You've no business here," he said, "and you know it. If you can't stick to the man you've married, come home with me to Maud." She made a sharp gesture toward him, as if on the verge of falling, and as sharply recovered herself. "Oh, how I wish I could," she breathed. Jake's hand, perfectly steady, full of sustaining strength, closed with authority upon her arm. "That's settled, then," he said. "Come now." But at this point the Italian burst furiously in upon them with a flood of unintelligible language that made all further speech impossible. Jake glanced momentarily over his shoulder, as if disturbed by the buzzing of some insect, then with unruffled composure turned back to the girl. His eyes looked straight into hers for perhaps 10 seconds, then in the same purposeful fashion he set her free, and deliberately turned upon the man who raged behind him. As he did so, there came a shouting and banging of doors along the platform, and the train began to move. Jake's massive shoulders braced themselves. Without words, he seized the raving Italian in a grip there was no resisting, swept him, as a sudden gale sweeps a leaf, across the compartment, sent him with a neat twist buzzing forth upon the platform, and very calmly shut the door and came back. Then there came a wild shriek of laughter from Toby, and she doubled up in her corner with hysterical mirth, gasping and gasping for breath, till he sat squarely down beside her and pulled her into the circle of his arm. "Easy, my girl, easy," he said. "We're not going to have an exhibition at this stage. You keep a stiff upper lip till you feel better." But the stiff upper lip was rather painfully lacking on that occasion. She very soon ceased to laugh, but for a long time thereafter she lay sobbing and shuddering like a little terrified animal against his breast while the train rushed on through the night. He was very gentle with her. Jake's stock of patience was practically limitless, and he and Toby had always had a certain comradeship between them. But when she grew calmer at last, he began to talk in the quiet, direct fashion habitual to him. "Say now, you've had a bit of a facer over this, but you needn't be frightened. You're safe enough from that damned Italian, anyway.
And you'll find me a better refuge than he is, if that's what you're wanting."
She shivered and pressed closer. "You don't know what you're in for," she whispered piteously.
"That so?" said Jake, unmoved. "Well, maybe you'd like to enlighten me."
But Toby shook her head with a sob. "I couldn't. I just couldn't, Jake. Do you mind?" Jake considered the point with slightly drawn brows.
"I guess there's no hurry," he decided at length. "We'll get home first, anyway. That's the main point. You won't be sorry to get back to Maud, I take it?"
She answered him with a swift and passionate fervor that spoke more clearly than any words of the anguish of her soul. "Oh, Jake, I wish I'd died. I wish I'd died before I left her." Jake's brows contracted more decidedly, but he said nothing further on the subject. Only after a moment or two he patted her shoulder reassuringly.
"I'll take care of you," he said. "You go to sleep."
8. The Turning Point. "You've brought her back," said Bunny in amazement. "You've actually brought her back. Here, Jake. Not here."
"It was the only thing to do," said Jake, between puffs of his pipe. "I'm sorry on your account, but well, you can keep out of her way."
Bunny's face was flushed. He stood on the hearth and stared down at Jake with a troubled countenance. "But you won't be able to keep her," he protested after a moment. "Charlie will come and get her away again, as soon as he knows. He's such a wily devil."
"He does know," said Jake.
"He knows? Who told him?"
"I told him," said Jake.
"You told him? What the devil for? I don't understand you, Jake." Bunny's tone had a touch of fierceness in it, almost of challenge. Jake's eyes came up to him with absolute steadiness.
"I told him," he said deliberately, "because he is the one person who has a right to know. He is her husband."
"I don't believe it," said Bunny violently. "He'd never marry her. It was a damn trick if he pretended to."
"No," Jake said, "it was not a trick. He has married her, and it's up to him to make the next move."
"But what on earth for?" demanded Bunny. "What made him do such a thing?"
"God knows," said Jake with a certain somberness. "He did it. That's all I know."
Bunny stamped round in a sudden fury and began to pace the room. "I suppose he did it to defeat me. Did he actually think I should want her after Bunny!" Swift and sharp as a whiplash, Jake's voice cut across the words. "Stop that. Pull up and sit down." Bunny wheeled and came back in silence. His face was deadly pale, but he sat down on the edge of the table by Jake's side. Jake reached out a leisurely hand and gripped him by the knee.
"Between you and me, my son," he said, "I don't think you came into the reckoning at all. I can't tell you exactly what happened, because I don't know, but I'm pretty sure that Saltash married her from a somewhat stronger motive than just to put you out of the running. As you say, he could have done that without taking all that trouble. He's treated you damn badly, I admit, but it's just possible he couldn't help himself, and anyway I don't think he's hurt you seriously, except in the place where you keep your pride."
"You think I didn't love her?" broke in Bunny, moving restlessly under his hand. Jake's eyes had the glimmer of a smile as he met the boy's hot look.
"I think you don't love her now, anyway, Bunny," he said.
"You're quite right," said Bunny, shortly. "I don't. I never want to see her again, now I know what she is."
"You don't know,"
said Jake. "She has always been an unknown quantity to you. That's why I've always felt doubtful about you.
Guess you never loved her quite enough, boy. That was your trouble."
"Didn't love her?" ejaculated Bunny. Jake nodded.
"Or you'd have understood her better, stood by her better."
"I'd have loved her fast enough if she'd loved me," protested Bunny. "But that scoundrel always came first with her. I never had a chance."
"Oh, yes, you had."
Again the faint smile showed for an instant in the elder man's eyes.
"Not much of one, perhaps, but you had a chance. If she'd been quite sure of you, she wouldn't have run away."
"Wouldn't she? Then she can't be very sure of Saltash, either." Bunny spoke with a certain gloomy triumph. Jake blew forth a cloud of smoke and watched it rise thoughtfully. "I'm waiting for Saltash," he said. "I've got him on test." "You believe in him?" questioned Bunny contemptuously. Jake's eyes remained fixed. "I believe," he said slowly, "that there comes a turning point in every man's life, whatever he's been, when he either makes good or throws in his hand altogether. I've been through it myself, and I know what it means. It's Saltash's turn now." "Oh, rot, Jake!" Bunny turned on him with the old boyish admiration shining in his eyes. Why, you've made good every time. Just about as often as Charlie has done the other thing." "No." Jake spoke without elation. "I did make good, but I went through hell first, and I very nearly failed. It may be the same with him. If so, well, poor devil, he has my sympathy." "You can't be sorry for a hound like Saltash," remonstrated Bunny. Jake turned squarely and faced him. "Well, there you're wrong, Bunny," he said. "I reckon I'm sorrier for him than I am for you. You've got a clean record, and you'll win out and marry Sheila Melrose. But Saltash, well, he's got a damn heavy handicap, and if he pulls off this, it'll be one of the biggest events I've ever seen. Say, what's the matter?" Bunny had sprung to his feet. He stood looking at Jake with an expression half startled and half indignant. "Jake! You beast! What made you say that?" he demanded. "What?" said Jake, and began to smile openly. "Well, it's pretty near the mark, isn't it? I saw which way the wind was trying to blow some time ago. Mean to say you didn't?" Bunny swung upon his heel. "Confound you!" he said, and was silent for several seconds. Jake smoked imperturbably on. He knew all the workings of Bunny's mind with the sure intuition of long intimacy. When finally the boy spoke again without turning, he almost knew what he would say. "Think I'm very despicable, Jake?" The question had a shamed and sullen ring. Bunny's head was bent. He was examining a little china figure on the mantelpiece with nervous concentration. Jake arose without fuss or preliminary, and pushed a brotherly arm round the bent shoulders. "Guess you've never been that, sonny," he said very kindly. "But you take an old man's advice and go a bit slow. She'll think all the better of you for it." "She'll never look at me," muttered Bunny, gripping the hand that pressed his shoulder without raising his eyes. "Oh, won't she?" said Jake. "I've seen her look at you more than once, and the old general, too. Reckon they both thought you were throwing yourself away on Toby, and maybe they had some reason to think so. Anyway, she never was your sort. I seem to remember telling you so once." "I was a fool," said Bunny, and then in a moment straightened himself and looked Jake in the eyes. "It wasn't Toby's fault," he said with abrupt generosity. "She didn't want to get engaged to me. I made her. I knew, all along, she wasn't very keen. But I thought I loved her enough to make it all right. I was wrong. I didn't." "Beginning to know better?" suggested Jake with a smile. "Beginning to realize what a fool I've been," said Bunny ruefully. "You don't think I've done for myself, then? Think I've still got a chance?" "Sure thing," said Jake. "But go carefully. You've got a fence or two to clear before you get home." He paused a moment, then gave him a kindly hand grip. "Say, Bunny," he said, "there's nothing despicable about making a mistake. It's only when things go wrong and we don't play the game that there's anything to be ashamed of. I've always been ready to stake my last dollar that you'd never do that." "Oh, man," Bunny said in swift embarrassment, "that shows how much you know about me." Jake stooped to knock out the ashes of his pipe in the fender. "What I don't know about you, my son," he said, "ain't worth a donkey's bray, I reckon, so you can shut your mouth on that. I'm going back to Maud now. Any messages?" "Yes." Bunny was standing up very straight. His eyes were shining. "Love to Maud, of course. I shan't come round at present. But tell Toby that when I do she needn't be worried over anything. We're all square. Tell her that." "I will," said Jake.
He turned to the door, then paused, looking back. "And say," he said, "don't you butt in with Saltash. Just leave him to manage his own fate. He's riding a bucking horse, but I've a notion he'll yet make good, if he can." "He's a rum devil," said Bunny. "All right, I shan't interfere." After Jake had gone he sat down and pulled a letter from his pocket. All the lines of perplexity smoothed out of his boyish face as he read it. It was the letter of a woman who had written because she wanted to write, not because she had anything to say, and Bunny's eyes were very tender as he came to the end. He sat for a space gazing down at the signature, and at length, with a gesture half shamefaced, he put it to his lips. "Yes, I've been a fool, Sheila," he said softly, "but, thank heaven, I was pulled up in time. And I shan't ever make that mistake again." Which was, perhaps, exactly what the writer had meant him to say. 9. Larpent. "Shall we dig a deep, deep hole for you to lie in?" asked Eileen, with serious violet eyes upraised. "And then cover you right up to your head so as you won't catch cold?" chimed in Molly. "Betty dig too! Betty dig too!" cried the youngest of the party with zest. "Zite up over Auntie Toy's head." "What an excellent idea!" said Toby with resignation. She sat down in the golden afternoon sunshine that flooded the beach, the three children buzzing happily about her, and rested her chin on her hands. The blue eyes that dwelt upon the misty horizon were very tired. They had the heavy look of unshed tears, and all the delicate colour was gone from her face. Her slight figure drooped pathetically. She sat very still. All the elasticity of youth seemed to have gone out of her. Once or twice a sharp sigh caught her that was almost like a sob. Betty's shrill voice at her side recalled her from her dreams. "Betty tired now, Auntie Toy. Betty tumin to sit down." She turned and took the child upon her lap, with a fondling touch and tender words. Betty pillowed a downy head against her neck and almost immediately fell asleep. Eileen and Molly laboured on at their self-imposed task in the autumn sunshine, and Toby returned to her dreams. Perhaps she had also begun to doze, for the day was warm and sound sleep had forsaken her of late, when the falling of a shadow aroused her very swiftly to the consciousness of someone near at hand whose approach she had not heard. She controlled her quick start before it could awaken the sleeping child, but her eyes as they flashed upwards had the strained, panic-stricken look of a hunted animal. She made an almost involuntary movement of shrinking, and the blood went out of her lips, but she spoke no word. A man in a navy blue yachting suit stood looking down at her with blue-grey eyes that tried to be impersonal, but failed at the slight gesture of hers. "You needn't be afraid of me, heaven knows," he said. "I'm not," said Toby promptly, and flung him her old boyish smile. "I wasn't expecting just you at that moment, that's all. Sit down and talk, Captain, if that's what you've come for." Apparently it was. He lowered himself to the sand beside her. But at once, as by irresistible habit, his eyes sought the horizon, and he sat and contemplated it in utter silence. Toby endured the situation for a few difficult seconds, then took brisk command. "Why don't you have a smoke?" she said. "You'd find it a help." He put his hand mechanically into his pocket and took out his cigarette case. His eyes came back out of space as he did so, and rested upon the fair-haired child in the girl's arms. "So you've come back to the old job," he said. Toby nodded. "Yes, Jake's doing. I'm waiting to be divorced." He made a slight movement of surprise, but his face remained inscrutable. "You'll have to wait some time for that." Toby tilted her chin with a reckless gesture that was somehow belied by the weariness of her eyes. "That wasn't what you came to talk about, then?" she suggested after a pause. "No." Larpent's voice had a curious, almost deprecating quality. "I came to bring you a message." "A message?" She started slightly, and in a moment the defiance went out of her attitude. She turned towards him. Who is it from?" Larpent's far-seeing eyes came gravely to meet her own. "From Roselle Daubeny," he said. "Ah!" A quick shiver went through Toby. She averted her look. "I don't want to hear it," she said. "I've got to deliver it," said Larpent, with a hint of doggedness, "and you've got to listen. But you needn't be afraid. It isn't going to make any difference to you. The time has gone for that." He paused, but Toby sat in silence, her face bent over Betty's fair head. When he spoke again, his eyes had gone back to the quiet sea and the far horizon. There was a hint of pathos about him, albeit his face was grim. "It may have surprised you to see me in Paris with her," he said. "I'm not the sort of a man that runs after that type of woman. But I went to Roselle because she was dying, and because once, long ago, she was my wife." A faint sound came from Toby, but she still did not speak or lift her face. Larpent went on, steadily, unemotionally. "She went wrong, ran away, while I was at sea. She was too young to be left alone. Afterwards, too late, a child was born. She told me the night before she died that the child was mine." "Good God!" said Toby under her breath. He went on, grimly monotonous. "I never knew of the child's existence. If I had known, it might have made a difference. But it's too late now. She wanted me to find and protect the child. I promised to do my best, and when I found her I was to tell her one thing. Roselle prayed for her child's forgiveness every day." He ceased to speak, and there fell a silence, long and painful. The tide was turning, and the soft wash of tiny breakers came up the sand. Sea and sky mingled together, opalescent in the misty sunlight. The man's eyes gazed without seeing. Toby's were full of tears. He turned at last and looked at her; then, moved by what he saw, laid an awkward hand upon her arm. "I'm not asking anything from you," he said, "but I'd like you to know I'd have done more, if I'd known." She threw him a quick look, choking back her tears. It's rather funny, isn't it?" she said, with a little crack of humour in her voice. I'm very sorry, Captain Larpent." "Sorry?" he said. "For you," said Toby, with another piteous choke. "I've been foisted on to you so often. And you've hated it so." "That's the tragic part of it," said Larpent. She brushed away her tears and tried to smile. "I wonder you bothered to tell me," she said. His hand closed almost unconsciously upon her arm. "I had to tell you," he said. "It's a thing you ought to know." He hesitated a moment, then concluded with obvious effort. "And I wanted to offer you my help." "Thank you," whispered Toby. You that's very generous of you." She gulped again, and recovered herself. "What do you want to do about it?" she said. "Do? Well, what can I do?" He seemed momentarily disconcerted by the question. Toby became brisk and businesslike. "Well, you don't want to retire and live in a cottage with me, do you? We shouldn't either of us like that, should we?" "There's no question of that now," said Larpent quietly. "Your home is with your husband, not with me." Toby flinched a little. "My home isn't anywhere, then," she said. "When I left him it was for good." "Why did you leave him?" said Larpent. Toby's lips set in a firm line, and she made no answer. Larpent waited a few moments, then, "It's no matter for my interference," he said, "but it seems to me you've made a mistake in one particular. You don't realize why he married you." Toby made a small passionate movement of protest. "He ought not to have done it," she said, in a low voice. "I ought not to have let him. I thought I could play the part. I know now I can't. And he knows it, too." "I think you'll have to play the part," Larpent said. "No." She spoke with vehemence. "It's quite impossible. He has been far too good, far too generous. But it shan't go on. He's got to set me free. If he doesn't " She stopped abruptly. "Well, if he doesn't?" Larpent's voice was unwontedly gentle, and there was compassion in his look. Toby's eyes avoided his. "I'll find a way for myself," she said almost inarticulately. Larpent's fingers tightened again upon the thin young arm. "It's no good fighting fate," he said. "Why has it become impossible? Just because he knows all about you? Do you suppose that, or anything else is going to make any difference at this stage. Do you imagine he would let you go for that?"
Toby's arm strained against him. "He'll have to," she declared stubbornly. "He doesn't know all about me, either, any more than you do. And he's never going to know." Her voice shook stormily. She glanced about her desperately as if in search of refuge. The child in her arms stirred and woke. Larpent got up as if the conversation were ended. He stood for a moment irresolute, then walked across to the two little girls digging busily a few yards away. Eileen greeted him with her usual shy courtesy. "Won't you wait a little longer?" she said. "We're very nearly finished." "Nearly finished," echoed Molly. "Isn't it a booful big hole?"
"What's it for?" asked Larpent. Toby's voice answered him. She had risen and followed him. It had an odd break in it, the sound of laughter that is mingled with tears.
"They're digging a hole to bury me in. Isn't it a great idea?"
He wheeled and looked at her. There was no sign of tears in the wide blue eyes that met his own. Yet he put his hand on her shoulder with a gesture of one who comforts a child. "Before I go," he said, "I want to tell you something. Something no one has told me, but that I've found out for myself. There is only one thing on this earth worth having. Only one thing that counts. It isn't rank or wealth or even happiness. It swamps the lot, just because it's the only thing in God's creation that lasts. And you've got it. In heaven's name, don't throw it away." He spoke with the simplicity and strength of a man who never wastes his words, and having spoken, he released her without farewell, and turned away. Toby stood quite motionless for several seconds, watching him. Then, as he did not look round, hurriedly she addressed the eldest child. "Take care of Betty a moment, Eileen darling. I shall be back directly." And with the words she was gone, like an arrow in pursuit. He must have heard her feet upon the sand, but he did not turn. Perhaps his thoughts were elsewhere, for when at the quick pressure of her hand on his arm he paused to look at her, she saw that his eyes were very sad. "Well?" he said, with the glimmer of a smile. "Well, 'Toinette?" She clasped her two hands upon his arm, holding it very tightly, her face uplifted. "Please, I want to thank you," she said breathlessly. "You have been so very good." He shook his head. "I have done nothing," he said. "Don't thank me." She went on with nervous haste. "And it does make a difference to me. I'm glad, I know, though it must have been a great shock to you." "It would have been a much worse shock if it had been anyone else," he said. "Would it? How nice of you." Her lip trembled. "Well, then, I'm glad it wasn't." She began to walk with him. "Do you mind telling me? Did you forgive her?" "Yes," he said very quietly. A quick shiver went through her. "Then I must too," she said. "At least, I must try. I loved her once, you know, before I began to understand." "Everyone loved her," he said. "But life is very difficult, isn't it?" she urged rather tremulously. "Your life has been," he said. She nodded. "One can't help making mistakes, even bad ones, sometimes." "You've just made one," he said. She faced him valiantly. "Ah, but you don't understand. You can't throw away what you've never had, can you?" "What you've got," he corrected gravely. "Yes, you can." She flung out her hands with a wide gesture. "But I haven't got it. I never had it. He took me out of pity. He never pretended to love me." "No," said Larpent with grim certitude. "He isn't pretending this time." She stared at him, wide-eyed, motionless. "Not pretending? What do you mean? Please, what do you mean?" He held out his hand. "Good-bye," he said abruptly. "I mean just that." Her lips parted to say more, but something in his face or action checked her. She put her hand into his. "Good-bye," she said. He held her hand for a moment, then, moved by some hint of forlornness in the clear eyes, he bent,
as he had bent at the castle on that summer evening weeks before, and lightly touched her forehead with his lips. "Oh, that's nice of you," said Toby quickly. "Thank you for that."
"Don't thank me for anything," said Larpent. "Play a straight game, that's all."
And with the words he left her finally, striding away over the sand with that careless sailor's gait of his, gazing always far ahead of him out to the dim horizon. Perhaps as long as he lived his look would never again dwell upon anything nearer. End of Part 2, Chapters 7, 8, and 9. Part 4, Chapters 10 and 11 of Charles Rex by Ethel M. Dell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 10. In the Name of Love.
"It's been a funny game," said Saltash, with a wry grimace. "We've both of us been so damned subtle that it seems to me we've ended up much in the same sort of hole that we started in."
"But you're not going to stay in it," said Maud.
He turned and looked down at her, one eyebrow cocked at a comic angle. "Ma belle reine, if you can help us to climb out, you will earn my undying gratitude."
She met his look with her steadfast eyes.
"Charlie, do you know that night after night she cries as if her poor little heart were broken?" Saltash's eyebrow descended again. He scowled hideously. "Mais pourquoi? I have not broken it. I have never even made love to her."
Maud's face was very compassionate. "Perhaps that is why. She is so young, so forlorn, and so miserable. Is it quite impossible for you to forgive her?"
"Forgive her?" said Saltash. "Does she want to be forgiven?"
"She is fretting herself ill over it," Maud said. "I can't bear to see her. No, she has told me nothing, except that she is waiting for you to throw her off, to divorce her."
"Charlie, you wouldn't do that even if you could." Saltash was silent, the scowl still upon his face.
"Tell me you wouldn't,"
she urged. His odd eyes met hers with a shifting gleam of malice. "There is only one reason for which I would do that, ma chère," he said. "So she has not told you why she ran away with my friend Spentoli?"
Maud shook her head. "She does not speak of it at all. I only know that she was unspeakably thankful to Jake for protecting her from him."
"Ah!" Saltash's teeth showed for an instant. "I also am grateful to Jake for that. He seems to have taken a masterly grip of the situation. Is he aware that he broke Spentoli's arm, I wonder? It was in the papers alongside the tragic death of Roselle, fall of a famous sculptor from a train. It will keep him quiet for some time, I hear, and has saved me the trouble of calling him out. I went to see him in the hospital."
"You went to see him?"
Maud exclaimed. Saltash nodded, the derisive light still in his eyes. "And conveyed my own condolences. You may tell La Petite from me that I do not propose to set her free on his account. He is not what I should describe as a good and sufficient cause."
"Thank heaven for that!" Maud ejaculated with relief.
"Amen," said Saltash piously, and took out his cigarette case. She watched him with puzzled eyes till the cigarette was alight, and he smiled at her through the smoke, his swarthy face full of mocking humour.
"Now tell me," she said then, "how can I help you?"
He made a wide gesture. "I leave that entirely to your discretion, madam. As you may perceive, I have wholly ceased to attempt to help myself."
"You are not angry with her?" she hazarded.
"I am furious," said Charles Rex royally. She shook her head at him.
"You're not in earnest, and it wouldn't help if you were. Besides, you couldn't be angry with the poor little thing. Charlie, you love her, don't you? You want her back?"
He shifted his position slightly so that the smoke of his cigarette did not float in her direction. His smile had a whimsical twist. "Do I want her back?" he said. "On my oath, it's hard to tell."
"Oh, surely,"
Maud said. She rose impulsively and stood beside him.
"Charlie," she said, "why do you wear a mask with me? Do you think I don't know that she is all the world to you?"
He looked at her, and the twisted smile went from his face. "There is no woman on this earth that I can't do without," he said. "I learnt that when I lost you."
"Ah!" Maud's voice was very pitiful. Her hand came to his. "But this is different. Why should you do without her? You know she loves you." His fingers closed spring-like about her own. A certain hardness was in his look. "If she loves me," he said, "she can come back to me of her own accord." "But if she is afraid?" Maud pleaded. "She has no reason to be," he said. "I have claimed nothing from her. I have never spoken a harsh word to her. Why is she afraid?" "Have you understood her?" Maud asked, very gently. He made an abrupt movement as though the question, notwithstanding the absolute kindness of its utterance, had somehow an edge for him. The next moment he began to laugh. "Why ask these impossible riddles? Has any man ever understood a woman? Let us dismiss the subject. And since you are here, ma belle reine, you of all people, let us celebrate the occasion with a drink, even if it be only tea." His eyes laughed into hers. The western light was streaming in across the music room. They stood together in the turret beyond Saltash's piano, where she had found him pouring out wild music that made her warm heart ache for him. She had come to him with the earnest desire to help, but he baffled her at every turn, this man to whom once in the days of her youth she had been so near. She could not follow the complex workings of his mind. He was too quick to cover his feelings. His inner soul had long been hidden from her. Yet the conviction persisted that if any could pass that closed door that he kept so persistently against all comers, it would be herself. She had once possessed the key, and she could not believe that it was no longer in her power to turn it. He would surely yield to her, though he barred out all beside. Perhaps he read her thoughts, for the laugh died out of his eyes, melting into the old tender raillery that she remembered so well. "Will you drink with me?" he said. "You have actually stooped to enter my stronghold without your bodyguard. Will you not honor me still further, partake of my hospitality?" She smiled at him. "Of course I will have tea with you with pleasure, Charlie. Didn't you realize I was waiting to be asked?" "You are very gracious," he said, and crossed the room to ring a bell. She remained in the western turret, looking out over the beech woods that blazed golden in the sun to the darker pine woods beyond. "What a paradise this is!" she said, when he joined her again. His restless eyes followed hers without satisfaction. A certain moodiness had come upon him. He made no answer to her words. "Why doesn't Bunny come up to see me?" he asked suddenly. "He knows I am here." She looked at him in surprise. "Are you expecting him?" He nodded with a touch of arrogance. "Yes. Tell him to come. I shan't quarrel with him, or he with me. Is he still thirsting for my blood? He's welcome to it if he wants it." "Charlie!" she protested. He turned from her and sat down at the piano. His fingers began to caress the keys, and then in a moment the old sweet melody that he had played to her in the long ago days came softly through the room. Her lips formed the words as he played, but she made no sound. "There has fallen a splendid tear from the passion flower at the gate. She is coming, my dove, my dear. She is coming, my life, my fate. The red rose cries, she is near, she is near. And the white rose weeps, she is late. The larkspur listens, I hear, I hear. And the lily whispers, I wait." "She is certainly very late," commented Charles Rex quizzically from the piano. "And the lily is more patient than I am. Why don't you sing, Maud of the Roses?" She started a little at his voice, but she did not answer. She could not tell him that her throat was dumb with tears. He played softly on for a space, then as the old butler entered with the tea tray he abruptly left the piano to wait upon her. He made her sit in the window seat, and presently sat down himself and talked of indifferent things. She did not attempt to bring him back to the matter in hand. She knew him too well for that. If he chose to be elusive, no power on earth could capture him. But she had a strong feeling that he would not seek to elude her wholly. He might seem to trifle, as a monkey swinging idly from bough to bough, but he had an end in view, and ultimately he would reach that end, however circuitous the route. He surprised her eventually by the suddenness with which he pounced upon it. He had turned the talk upon the subject of his new yacht, And very abruptly he announced his intention of going round the world in her. "Not alone," she said, and then would have checked the words, lest they should seem to ask too much. But he answered her without a pause. "Yes, alone. And if I don't come back, Bunny can marry Toby and reign here in my stead. That is, if he isn't an infernal fool. If he is, then Toby can reign here alone, with you and Jake to take care of her." "But, Charlie, why? Why?" The words leapt from Maud in spite of her. He frowned at her whimsically. "They've always cared for one another. Don't you know it? It's true she put me in a shrine and worshipped me for a time, but I couldn't live up to it. Figurez-vous, ma chère, myself, a marble saint." "You never understood her," Maud said. He shrugged his shoulders and went lightly on. "Oh, she was ready enough to offer me human sacrifice, but that wasn't enough for me. Besides, I didn't want sacrifice. I have stood between her and the world. I have given her protection. But it was a free gift. I don't take anything in exchange for that." An odd note sounded in his voice, as of some emotion suppressed. He leaned back against the window frame, his hands behind his head. "That wasn't what I married her for. I tried to prove that to her. I actually thought," the old derisive grin leapt across his face, "that I could win her trust like any ordinary man. I failed, of course. Failed hideously. She never expected decent treatment from me. She never even began to trust me. I was far too heavily handicapped for that. And so, as soon as the wind changed, the boat capsized." "What made the wind change?" Maud asked gently. He looked across at her, the baffling smile still in his eyes. "The gods played a jest with us," he said. "It was only a small jest, but it turned the scale. She fled. That was how I came to realize I couldn't hold her. I had traveled too fast, as usual, and she couldn't keep up. Well," he unlocked his hands and straightened himself, "it's up to Bunny now. I'll let her go to him." "My dear!" Maud said. He laughed at her with the old half caressing ridicule. "That shocks you. But why, if they love each other? Haven't I heard you preach the gospel of love as the greatest thing on earth? Didn't you once tell me that I had yet to learn the joy," his smile twisted again, "the overwhelming joy, of setting the happiness of another before one's own? This thing can be done quite simply and easily, as I suggested to you long ago. She has only to go away with him, and I do the rest. A moral crime, no more. Yes, it is against your code, of course. But consider. I only stand to lose that which I have never possessed. For the first time in my life I commit a crime in the name of love." He laughed over the word, yet even through the scoffing sound there came a ring of pain. His face had a drawn look, the wistfulness of the monkey that has seen its prize irrevocably snatched away. Maud rose quickly. There was something in his attitude or expression that she could not bear. "Oh, you are wrong. You are wrong," she said. "You have the power to make her love you. And you love her. Charlie, this thing has not been given you to throw away. You can't. You can't." He made a sharp gesture that checked her. "My dear Maud," he said, "there are a good many things I can't do, and one of them is this. I can't hold any woman against her will. No, not if she were my wife 10 times over. I wouldn't have let her go to Spentoli. But Bunny is a different matter. I have Jake's word for it that he will make her a better husband than I shall. If Bunny wants to know all about her past, her parentage, he can come to me and I can satisfy him. Tell him that. But if he really loves her, he won't care a damn, any more than I do." "Ah," Maud said. She stood a moment, looking at him, and in her eyes was that mother look of a love that understands. She held out her hand to him. "Thank you for telling me, Charlie," she said. "Good bye." He held her hand. "What have I told you?" he asked, abruptly. She shook her head. "Never mind now. You have just made me understand, that's all. I will give your message to Bunny, to them both. Good bye." He stooped in his free, gallant way to kiss her hand. "After all," he said, "I return to my old allegiance. It was you, chère reine, who taught me how to love." She gently freed her hand and turned to go. "No," she said, "I think it was God who taught you that." For the second time Charles Rex failed to utter the scoffing laugh she half expected. The odd eyes looked after her with a kind of melancholy irony. "To what purpose?" he said. 11. The Gift of the Gods. A chill wind blew across the ramparts, bringing with it the scent and the sound of the sea. There was no moon in the sky to night, only the clouds flying over the stars, obscuring and revealing them alternately, making their light weirdly vague and fitful. Across the park an owl called persistently, its eerie hoot curiously like the cry of a human voice through the rustling night. The trees were murmuring together down by the lake, as though some mysterious news were passing to and fro among them. And once more, alone on his castle walls, Saltash paced restlessly up and down. It was his last night at Birchester, so he told himself, for many a year to come. The fever for change was upon him. He had played his last card, and lost. It was characteristic of the man to turn his back upon his losses and be gone. His soul had begun to yearn for the wide spaces, and it was in answer to the yearning that he had come up to his eagle's eyrie a second time. He could not be still, and the feeling of walls around him was somehow unbearable. But he expected no vision to-night. He walked in darkness. Down in the harbor his yacht was waiting, and he wondered cynically what whim kept him from joining her. Why was he staying to drain the cup to the dregs, he, who had the whole world to choose from? He had sent his message, he had made his sacrifice. At what a cost, not even Maud would ever know. It was the first voluntary sacrifice he had ever made, he reflected ironically, and he marveled at himself to find that he cared so much. For after all, what was it he had sacrificed? Nothing worth having, so he told himself. He had possessed her childish adoration, but her love, never. And very curiously, it was her love that he had wanted. Actually, for the first time in his life, no less a thing had appealed to him. Jaded and weary with long experience, he owned now to a longing for that at which all his life long he had scoffed. The longing was not to be satisfied. He was to go empty away. But yet the very fact that he had known it had in some inexplicable fashion purified him from earthly desires. He had, as it were, reached up and touched the spiritual, and that which is not spiritual had crumbled away below him. He looked back upon the desert through which all his life he had traveled, and saw only sand. The sound of the turret door banging behind him recalled him to his surroundings. He awoke to the fact that the wind was chill, and that a drift of rain was coming in from the sea. With an impatient shrug he turned. Why was he lingering here like a drunken reveller at a table of spilt wine? He would go down to his yacht and find Larpent, who had also loved and lost. They would go out on the turn of the tide, the two losers in the game of life, and leave the spilt wine behind them. Impulsively he strode back along the ramparts. The game was over, and he would never play again, but at least he would face the issue like a man. No one, not even Larpent, should ever see him flinch. So he reached the turret door and came abruptly to a halt. It was no vision that showed her to him, standing there in her slender fairness, wrapped in a cloak that glimmered vaguely blue in the glimmering starlight. Her face was very pale, and he saw her frightened eyes as she stood before him. Her hands were tightly clasped together, and she spoke no word at all. The door was shut behind her, and he saw that she was trembling from head to foot. He stood motionless within reach of her, but not touching her. "Well?" he said. She made a curious gesture with her clasped hands, standing before him as she had stood on board his yacht on that night in the Mediterranean when she had come to him for refuge. "I've come," she said in a voice that quivered uncontrollably, "to tell you something." Saltash did not stir. His face was in shadow, but there was a suggestion of tension about his attitude that was not reassuring. "Well?" he said again.
She wrung her hands together with a desperate effort to subdue her agitation, and began again. "I've come to tell you something." "Something I don't know?" he questioned cynically. She nodded. Something you don't want to know. It was Maud made me come." That moved him a little. That piteous stammer of hers had always touched his compassion. "Don't fret yourself, ma chère," he said. "I know all there is to know, all about Roselle, all about Larpent, all about Spentoli." You don't know this," said Toby. You don't know why I ran away from you in Paris." "Don't I?" he said, and she heard the irony of his voice. "I have an agile brain, my child. I can generally jump the gaps pretty successfully." She shook her head with vehemence. "And how do you know about Spentoli?" she demanded suddenly. "Who told you that?" "The man himself," said Saltash. "Ah! And what did he tell you?" A note of fierceness sounded in her voice. She seemed to gather herself together like a cornered animal preparing to make a wild dash for freedom. Saltash made her a queer, abrupt bow, and in so doing he blocked the way before her so that she could only flee by the way she had come. "He told me nothing that I did not know before," he said. "Nothing that your own eyes had not told me long ago." "What do you mean?" breathed Toby, pressing her clasped hands tightly to her breast. Her eyes were still upraised to his. They glittered in the dimness. Saltash answered her more gently than was his wont. "I mean that I know the sort of inferno your life had been. A perpetual struggle against odds that were always overwhelming you. If it hadn't been so you would never have come to me for shelter. Do you think I ever flattered myself that that was anything but a last resource? The final surrender to circumstance? If I had failed you—" "Wait," Toby broke in tersely. "You're right in some things. You're wrong there. It's true I was always running away, as soon as I was old enough to realize the rottenness of life. Spentoli tried to ruin me, but I dodged him, and then, when he trapped me, the hell hound, I did my best to murder him." The breath suddenly whistled through her teeth. "I tried to stab him to the heart. God knows I tried. But I suppose it wasn't in the right place, for I didn't get there. I left him for dead. I thought he was dead, till that day in Paris. And ever since, it's been just a nightmare fight for life and safety. I'd have tried some other dodge if you hadn't found me. I was not quite down and out. But you made all the difference. I had to go to you." "And why?" said Charles Rex. She rushed on regardless of question. The floodgates were open. She was hiding nothing from him now. "You came. If you'd been an angel from heaven, you couldn't have been more wonderful. You helped me, believed in me, gave me always the benefit of the doubt, made a way of escape for me, made life possible, even beautiful." She choked a little over the word. "I offered you just everything. I couldn't help it. You were the only man in the world to me. How could I help worshipping you? You were always so splendid, so great. You made me realize that life was worth having. You made me believe in God." She broke into sudden wild tears. "And you didn't love me enough even to take the little I had to give. I didn't want you to marry me. I never dreamt of such a thing. I had kept myself from harm, but I knew very well I wasn't fit to be your wife. Only I loved you so. And when I knew that Bunny was turning against me, would never believe in me, I just couldn't help turning to you again. And then you went and married me." She wrung her hands tragically. "I ought not to have let you. God will never forgive me for it. I don't deserve to be forgiven. But I loved you. I loved you." She covered her face and sobbed. Saltash reached out a hand and took her by the shoulder. "Nonette, Nonette," he said, in a voice that was strangely uncertain. "Don't cry, child. Don't cry." She drew herself away from him. Don't.
I don't want you to. I just came to tell you, that's all, in case you should think I ever cared for Bunny. Maud says you ought to know that. We only played together. We never really loved each other. I wasn't his sort, or he mine. He doesn't want me back. I wouldn't go if he did. I ran away with that damn cursed Bentoli to give you a chance to drop me. I couldn't face you after you knew everything. You'd never loved me, and I tricked you too badly. I knew you'd want to get free. Why didn't you start in and get a divorce? Why didn't you? Why didn't you?" She suddenly lifted her face, storming the words, electrified as it were by the wild force of her passion. Again he reached a hand towards her, but she eluded him with a desperate gesture. "No, no, don't touch me. Don't touch me. I can't bear it. I'm going now. I'm going right away. You'll never see me again, never hear of me. And you'll be free. Do you understand? You'll be quite free. I'll keep that promise I made to you. It won't be difficult. No one shall ever know how. And only you who never even pretended to love me, will be able to guess why." She turned about with the words and wrenched furiously at the door behind her. In another moment she would have been gone. But in that moment Saltash moved, perhaps more swiftly than he had ever moved in his life before, and in a flash he had her in his arms. She fought for her freedom then like a terrified animal, twisting this way and that, straining with frenzied effort to escape. And when, his hold encompassing her, he broke down her resistance, pressing her indomitably closer and closer, till she lay powerless and palpitating against his breast, she burst into agonized tears, beseeching him, imploring him to set her free. "Why should I?" he said, still holding her. "Don't you know yet that it's the very last thing I mean to do?" "You must. Oh, you must," she cried back. "You can't you can't hold me against my will." "That's true," said Saltash, as if struck by something. "And are you capable of leaving me against mine?" His hold relaxed with the words, and instantly she sprang away from him, sprang like a fleeing bird upon the low parapet beside them, and in a second she was sliding out upon the narrow ledge that surrounded the great stone buttress of the turret. "Hell!" ejaculated Saltash, and gave a great leap as if he would pursue her, then with abrupt effort checked himself. He stood with one foot on the parapet and watched her, and in the vague starlight his eyes burned with the old mocking devilry behind which he had so long sheltered his soul. "So you think you'll get away from me that way, do you?" he said, and laughed his gibing laugh. "Well, you may try. Either stay there till you've had enough, or throw yourself over. I'll get you in any case." She came to a stand, her hands spread out on each side of her, her eyes turning back to him across the awful space that yawned between. Sheer depth was below her, but she did not seem aware of it. "I will throw myself over," she said with a tense purpose, "unless you promise, unless you swear, to let me go." He laughed again, but there was no mirth in the glittering eyes that looked back at her, neither mirth nor dismay, only the most arrogant and absolute mastery that she had ever encountered. "I promise nothing," he said, "except that one way or the other I'm going to have you. You can take your choice. You can sink or swim. But you won't get away. There is a bond between us that you can't break, however hard you try. Fling yourself over if you think it's worth it. And before you get to the bottom I shall be with you. I'll chase you through the gates of Hades. I've traveled alone far enough. For the future we go together. That I swear to God." Across the abyss he flung his tremendous challenge, the laugh still on his lips, and in his eyes the blazing derision that mocks at fate. And as she heard it, the girl's heart suddenly failed her. She began to tremble. Yet, even so, she made a last desperate bid for pride and freedom. She clutched at the cold stones on each side of her with nerveless, quivering fingers. "There is no bond between us," she gasped forth piteously. "There never has been." He flung back the words like a missile, unerring, blindingly direct. "No bond between us? Good God! Would I follow you through death if there were not?" And then, suddenly, with an amazing change to tenderness that leapt the void and enchained her where she stood. "Toby, Toby, you little ass! Don't you know I've loved you from the moment the night moth struck?" There was no questioning the truth of those words. A great sob broke from Toby, and the tension went out of her attitude. She stood for a few seconds with her head raised, and on her face the unutterable rapture of one who sees a vision. Then, with sharp anguish, "I can't come back," she cried like a frightened child. "I'm going to fall." Saltash straightened himself. His forehead was wet, but he did not pause for a moment. "I'm coming to you," he said. "Keep as you are, and I'll give you a hand to hold." She obeyed him as one dazed into submission. Blindly she waited, till with a monkey-like agility he also had traversed that giddy ledge to where she stood. His fingers met and gripped her own. "Now," he said, "come with me, and you are safe. You can't fall. My love is holding you up." She heard the laugh in his voice, and her panic died. Mutely she yielded herself to him. By the strength of his will alone she left the abyss behind. But when he lifted her from the parapet back to safety, she cried out as one whom fear catches by the throat, and fainted in his arms. Out of a great darkness the light dawned again for Toby. She opened her eyes, gasping to find that the scene had changed. She was lying upon tiger skins in Saltash's conical chamber, and he, the king of all her dreams, was kneeling by her side. That was the first thing that occurred to her, that he should kneel. "Oh, don't! Oh, don't!" she said quickly. "I am not Maud." He regarded her humorously, but the old derisive lines were wholly gone from his dark face. His eyes held something that was unfamiliar, something that made her quiver with a quick agitation that was not distress. "So I am only allowed to kneel to Maud," he said. She tried to meet his look, and failing, hid her face. I know you have always loved her," she murmured rather incoherently. You couldn't pretend to really love anyone else, after Maud." There fell a brief silence, and she thought the beating of her heart would choke her. Then there came the touch of his hand upon her head, and its wild throbbing grew calmer. "No," he said, and in his voice was a new deep note unknown to her. "I am not pretending, Nonette." The light touch drew her, as it were, magnetically. With a swift impulsive movement she raised herself, gave herself to him, hiding her face still more deeply against his breast. "But you couldn't really love me," she whispered like an incredulous child. "You sure you do?" His arms went round her, holding her fast. He made no other answer. Saltash, the glib of tongue and ready of jibe, was for once speechless in the presence of that which has no words. She nestled closer to him as a little furry animal that has found its home. Her incredulity was gone, but she kept her face hidden. "But why didn't you tell me before?" she said. He bent his black head till his lips reached and rested against her hair. "Nonette," he said, "you told me that I had made you believe in God." "Yes," she whispered back, rather breathlessly. "Yes." "That's why," he said. "You got me clean through my armor there. Egad, it made me a believer, too. If I'd failed you after that, well, he'd have been justified in damning me body and soul." "But you couldn't," she protested. "You couldn't fail me." His dark face twisted with the old wry grimace. "I failed a good many in my time, Nonette. But no one ever trusted me to that extent. You practically forced me to prove myself." A little gasp of relief came from Toby. She spoke with more assurance. "Oh, was that it? You were just trying to be good?" "Just trying," said Saltash. "You still trying?" asked Toby, a little curious note of laughter in her voice. "I shan't keep on much longer," he returned, "unless I get what I want." "There'd be a blue moon if you did," remarked Toby impudently. Saltash raised his head abruptly. "By Jupiter, there is one," he said. "Let's go to her." Toby's face shot upwards in a moment. "Where?" Her eyes sought the skylight above them and the dim mysterious blue of the night. His came down to her in a flash, dwelt upon her, caressed her, drew her. She turned sharply and looked at him. "Charles Rex," she said reproachfully. He took her pointed chin and laughed down at her. His eyes, one black, one grey, shone with a great tenderness, holding hers till they widened and shone back with a quick blue flame in answer. Then, "As I was saying," remarked Charles Rex royally, "when I was interrupted, some 6 months ago, I have never yet refused a gift from the gods." "But you've taken your time over accepting it, haven't you?" said Toby, with a chuckle. He bent to her. "Let's go," he said again. End of Part 4, Chapters 10 and 11. The End of Charles Rex, by Ethel M. Dell. Recorded by Celine Major.